The Maesta Panels. Prologue. The fresh smell of death permeated the inconsolable loft. Sunlight penetrated the scene and rested on the wooden floor as pale Venetian blinds swung back and forth in the evening breeze, eurythmically tapping gently against the wood-chipped frame. The fresh air from outside fought a losing battle with the rancid air within, while the only sound circulating was the persistent humming of an old-time refrigerator covered with magnetized photos. The flat was littered with toppled furniture and the contents of emptied drawers and boxes, testifying to a human struggle. A green velvet couch upheld the limp body of a young adult female, devoid of life, skin impossibly pale, lips of blue, and almond-gray eyes unnaturally wide open, witness to a violent and sudden end of breath. Dark red blood stained the body's pedestal and slowly dripped to the floor, forming a horrific seal, to be opened later. Chapter 1. David Wade arrived early at his Midtown Manhattan office for a scheduled 7 a.m. meeting with a potential client who insisted on booking the sit-down with him personally, thereby circumventing Wade's personal assistant. He had taken the call, despite his aide's protestation, after overhearing her annoyed side of the phone conversation the day before. Wade always arrived early for meetings, or any other activity. Young, he had inherited his father's habit of always showing up a bit late. He eventually abandoned family tradition, rejected the ignominy of tardiness, and embraced the newfound glories of punctuality. His potential client also apparently adhered to the same modus operandi by arriving 2 minutes shy of 7. "Good morning, Mr. Wade." "Hello, Mr. Martini," responded Wade with a welcoming tone. "Please have a seat." "Thank you for meeting with me on such short notice." Martini said this with a dry half-smile and a monotone pitch as he sat down while taking off his wide-brimmed hat and adjusting his horn-rimmed glasses. Without giving Wade a chance to continue the formalities, Martini blurted out his purpose. "I wish to hire you to perform a specific task, immediately, for which you shall be fairly compensated." "Go on," Wade interjected firmly. "I need to locate some lost medieval Italian artwork, masterpieces." Martini explained that the chefs-d'œuvre he pined for were celebrated works from master painter Duccio's wooden panel composition, The Maesta. His curiosity aroused by this odd request, Wade no longer interrupted and simply let the dignified older gentleman sitting across from him continue. "About 3 centuries ago, the painting was partially dismantled, with several panels sold and others eventually lost. I need to locate the lost panels." He took a deep breath, then patted his thinning salt and pepper hair and resumed. "I need you to find these panels and retrieve them for me, using all legal means at your disposal." He leaned forward, diligently placing a large manila envelope on Wade's desk. Wade examined the contents of the envelope and quickly realized that they contained a substantial amount of U.S. currency in large denominations. "This is a lot of money, Mr. Martini." "I know. And there will be 2 other similar envelopes if you succeed." "Why me?" Wade queried. "I have heard of your work, analyzed your reputation, and researched your talents." He paused, then completed his statement bluntly. "But I am especially impressed with your counter-current thinking process, unconventional methods, and dogged determination." A prolonged silence inhabited the room until Wade finally resumed the conversation. "How and where do I start?" "That, Mr. Wade, is why I hired you," hinting at a first genuine smile. "I expect you to answer your own questions as you embark upon this fascinating quest." Before Wade was able to gather more info from his mysterious client, Martini stood up and, without so much as the courtesy of a handshake, left the office. Wade was stunned. He remained seated, folded his arms, a perplexed look on his face. He knew little about his new client other than his surname and phone number. He knew very little about the objects he had just been hired to retrieve, and he knew nothing of the reasons for their retrieval. He slowly reopened the envelope, counted the cash, and put the money in his secure office safe. Martini, Duccio, Maesta. I need to know more, a lot more. Information is power. Denary. Chapter 2. At 7:56 a.m., Wade's personal assistant appeared in front of his office door wearing a dark shawl draped around her shoulders and holding a practical purse. "Good morning, Mr. Wade." "Good morning, Jen," reciprocating her habitual greeting while quickly glancing at the digital timepiece on his desk to confirm that, once again, she had consciously clocked in before 8 a.m. Her boss would not really mind if she was occasionally a few minutes late, but he greatly appreciated this part of her work ethos and character. Wade's personal aide, or secretary, as she might once have been called, was a bookishly attractive young woman of 25 named Jenny. Her shoulder-length blonde hair was always meticulously tied in a tight ponytail, exposing her slim, delicate facial traits. She was hired as his executive assistant, the title she insisted on 2 years earlier, following the completion of her international relations degree at Boston's Wellesley College. It was her first job in the real world, and she performed her wide-ranging duties with calm seriousness. Wade appreciated and respected her. Wade's grandfather, who often stopped by the office and liked Jenny, could not understand why the title of secretary was no longer employed and considered passé, pointing out that it seemed good enough for the country's highest diplomat and the UN's elected leader. "Oh, Jen," Wade said loudly, as she was no longer in his sightline, "once you get settled in, put everything aside and come join me. I have some urgent research to be done." She responded in the affirmative to the instructions and entered his office moments later holding her computer tablet, ready to work. Jenny Bradford was ambitious and totally devoted to her job and employer. She was pure New England blue blood stock with a Puritan work ethic to match. She was demanding of others, but especially demanding of herself. Jenny liked working for David Wade and enjoyed working in the Empire State Building. She cherished the memory of the first time she entered the Art Deco landmark and rode the iconic skyscraper's new state-of-the-art elevator to the 64th floor to meet her future boss. During that initial interview, she found him to be polite, professional, and to the point. To her amazement, he offered her the job on the spot, and she accepted with the same impulsiveness. Most workdays were very busy and interesting, including today. It was mid-afternoon when Jenny informed Wade that she was finished compiling the research. Wade thanked her and proceeded to review the results of her efforts via their secure internal office document sharing network. Reading, he learned that the northern Italian city of Siena commissioned Duccio to produce a panel for its cathedral's high altar, a work now known as the Maesta. The completed painting was brought into the cathedral on June 9, 1311. Wade especially enjoyed the description of the event related by a contemporary chronicler. "And on that day, when it was brought into the cathedral, all workshops remained closed, and the bishop commanded a great host of devoted priests and monks to file past in solemn procession. This was accompanied by all the high officers of the commune and by all the people. All honorable citizens of Siena surrounded said panel with candles held in their hands, and women and children followed humbly behind. They accompanied the panel amidst the glorious pealing of bells after a solemn procession on the Piazza del Campo into the very cathedral. And all this out of reverence for the costly panel. The poor received many alms, and we prayed to the Holy Mother of God, our patron saint, that she might in her infinite mercy preserve this our city of Siena from every misfortune, traitor or enemy." Wade also learned that the high altarpiece was painted on both sides and was originally over 16 feet in height and length. It remained on the cathedral's main high altar until 1506, and then was displayed on a different altar in a small side chapel located elsewhere in the church. In 1711, the altarpiece was taken apart in order to be partially displayed on both altars. Unfortunately, this dismantling was the reason for the work's present fragmentary condition. The frame, the lower predelas or pedestal, and the top crowning parts were removed, then sawn into 7 sections. The predellas were each painted on a horizontally laid piece of wood, and could therefore be dismantled easily. The central panel, 7 by 13 feet, posed a problem. On the front, it consisted of 11 boards arranged vertically, to which 5 horizontal boards were nailed from the back. The wood was very difficult to separate, having been glued and nailed together. The crude cutting or sawing process severely damaged the painted surface. Wade stopped reading, scrolling to view the various photos of the artwork provided by his meticulous aide. After a moment of reflection, he returned to the text and continued reading. He discovered that the primitive process of dismantling had led to other tragic consequences. Once the whole structure had been broken up, thereby destroying the frame, several individual scenes found their way to private collections or museums, while others simply went missing. The present-day online image of the entire Maesta was actually a composition reconstructed by art historians. Experts had reunited scattered scenes in a photographic montage, forming an approximate educated guess of how the masterpiece originally looked. Wade ceased reading and rubbed his eyes as he sat back in his custom-made black leather swivel chair. His mind drifted. The first swivel chair was invented by Thomas Jefferson and is purported to be the chair on which he drafted the United States Declaration of Independence in 1776. Wade occasionally recalled this quirky historical fact with pleasure, especially as he enjoyed the feel and comfort of his favorite seat on wheels. Refocusing, he cleared his desk in order to avoid distractions, and he pondered the task at hand. Why was I hired by Martini? Why an attorney? An art historian would have made for a better choice. Was Martini aware of Denary? No one was aware of Denary. 33-year-old David Wade was being modest to himself. He was not just any type of attorney. He was a highly successful international lawyer and an effective investigator. He was also an avid historian and skilled genealogist, having written books and given conferences around the world. But his expertise did not extend to European art. He decided to work around this weakness and rely on his strengths. He resolved to focus on the man, Duccio. He would learn more about Duccio's life and track down any remaining family connections to the famed painter. To accomplish this, he would employ the varied talents of his team. Denary. Chapter 3. Wade's passion for genealogy went back to his early school days at Ignatius Academy when he first discovered the joys of history in grade 2. Since then, he was fascinated by the study of families and the tracing of their lineages and history. He steadily mastered the standard tools of the trade, allowing him to obtain information about a family and to demonstrate kinship and pedigrees of its members. He eventually developed an extensive bank of knowledge and contacts around the world, allowing him to access the bloodlines of the most obscure. He prided himself on his unorthodox form of approaching and researching family trees by using methods often frowned upon by mainstream and traditional academics, including cutting-edge alternative genetic analysis using DNA. Thanks for the Duccio stuff, Jen. Well done. No problem, she replied matter-of-factly. You're the best secretary in the world, he responded teasingly. Very funny, she retorted, now standing in his doorway. And by the way, when will I be getting my executive assistant business cards? No one uses paper business cards anymore, Jen. Simply make yourself an e-card using my business font and logo. I will, she said, but I also want the real thing. Jenny headed towards her desk, but did an immediate about-face when Wade asked her to return. Jen, I want to talk with André Barthélemy. Pass him through when you reach him. She nodded and quickly returned to her station. Wade had known Barthélemy for years and had worked with him many times. Barthélemy was one of the best European genealogists. He never turned down a challenge, no matter how difficult. He was based in the French coastal city of La Rochelle in southwestern France, a seaport on the Bay of Biscay and capital of the Charente Maritime Department. Wade had often visited the area and first met Barthélemy years ago when doing research on his maternal ancestors. Barthélemy was the first to join Wade's group of experts, Denary. André, how are you, mon ami? Très bien, my dear David, très bien. What can I do for you at this late hour? Underscoring the 6-hour time difference between New York City and France, making it almost midnight in La Rochelle. Without giving Barthélemy the details of his client's specific request, Wade asked him to locate any living descendants of Duccio. Intrigued, Barthélemy accepted the challenge by stating enthusiastically, "I accept the défi. I will put my people to the task and get back to you late tomorrow with my progress." He knew Wade always expected daily reports on such matters. Wade delighted in this response and ended the conversation with his usual abruptness, dispensing with any pleasantries. "Jen," Wade blurted out loudly, "please send André all your research. Then close up shop, and thanks for a great day's work." A few moments later, Jenny left the office. Wade's spacious work area was now completely quiet, noiseless. He liked it that way. His ears were sensitive, too sensitive. Their hypersensitivity to everyday sounds was aggravating, while loud, spontaneous noise caused him great pain. Persistent ringing in both ears added to the toxic mix. His defective auditory perception was more than an inconvenience. It sometimes drove him crazy. He had soundproofed every square inch of his office and added custom-made noise-resistant windows to block all sounds that dared attempt to penetrate his zone of silence. Although he insisted on controlling the sounds in his living and workspaces, he knew the outside world presented different challenges. An uncontrollable jungle of sounds. Despite the drawbacks, he refused to isolate himself and readily traveled the globe. He was steadfast in his determination to overcome this affliction and not allow it to curtail his day-to-day activities. There was one advantage to his dire condition. He could hear everything. Sometimes that came in handy. He arose from behind his desk and began pacing. He often paced when dealing with a problem or analyzing a situation, physically searching for clarity of thought. He was even nicknamed Pacer by childhood friends for his back-and-forth cerebral style. Wade was not sure why or how 21st century descendants of Duccio could help him locate the lost artwork, but he had a hunch that it might advance his cause. Chapter 4. Taviana Buononsigna. Can you repeat that for me? Taviana Buononsigna, repeated Barthélemy, then proceeded to slowly spell the name. Wade put down his pen and looked upwards and took a deep breath. What do you know about her? Well, she is a young woman, age 30, born and raised in northern Italy, presently working at the University of Milan as a professor of art history. You're kidding, exclaimed Wade. You're kidding! Barthélemy related a few more personal details and pertinent info about this modern female descendant of Duccio. Wade was impressed. He knew that Barthélemy was fast, but finding and gathering this information in only 23 hours was really fast. Do you have any contact info for her? Oui, monsieur. I have a few telephone numbers, emails, and home address. Great, Wade said appreciatively. Send me everything you have. And André, you are the best, le meilleur. Thanks. Minutes later, Wade was reading the nourishing fruits of Barthélemy's findings. He was still shocked that a living lineal descendant had been found residing in the same general region of Italy that Duccio himself had worked and lived 7 centuries ago. Not only that, this young lady's given name was the same as Duccio's wife, Taviana, and the master's family name, Buononsigna, was apparently also still alive and well. Wade knew how rare this was. Most lineal descendants no longer carried the family name due to changes in spelling and adoption of different surnames through marriage over many generations. Technically, ancestors included those that lay in a direct or linear path over many generations, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, etc., and their respective offspring branching off along the way, siblings, cousins, second cousins, etc., known as collateral or lateral ancestors. Lineal and lateral descendants thus formed a branching tree, a family tree. Despite the odds, Duccio di Buononsigna's DNA was amazingly still beating inside Taviana Buononsigna, and she was an art expert. "Jen," Wade said forcefully, "have you read all the Barthélemy stuff yet?" "Yes, I have." She moved into Wade's line of sight. "You want me to place another late call to the old continent?" "You bet," he responded excitedly. While waiting to speak with Taviana Buononsigna, Wade returned to the Duccio books that Jen had purchased for him earlier in the day. The more he learned about the master, the more he was fascinated by him and the epoch in which he lived. Jenny abruptly entered his office with a concerned look on her face, explaining that she had a woman on the line who would not identify herself. Wade quickly pressed the speaker function on his phone. "This is David Wade from New York City. With whom am I speaking?" "You are talking to a friend of Taviana's," said a soft female voice with a slight accent. "I am sorry to bother you so late, but I was hoping to speak with Taviana." What felt like a long silence was finally broken by a tentative reply. "Taviana is not..." She hesitated. "Taviana is no longer..." She hesitated again. "How do you know her?" "I don't," said Wade. "I was simply hoping to talk to her about her work at the university." "Oh, I see," she replied sadly. "Unfortunately, Taviana is no longer available." Perplexed by this response, Wade asked the obvious question, "What do you mean?" Another pause descended on the conversation, followed by words that stung Wade's ears. "Taviana was killed 2 days ago." Chapter 5. Wade stood up, grasped the receiver, thereby terminating the speakerphone function. "She was killed?" "Yes. Taviana was killed 2 days ago." He slowly sat back in his chair. "Killed by accident or murdered? How did she die?" Wade heard a deep sigh, followed by a calm, measured, detailed explanation. "Taviana was murdered. Shot in her 4th-floor apartment during a struggle. Her flat was totally messed up, but nothing seems to have been taken. Not even her wallet, jewelry, or cell phone. Nothing. Her door wasn't forced, and although one window was open, it faces onto a well-frequented public square, a busy piazza." Wade sensed that he would not be given any further info unless he revealed the true purpose of his call. He proceeded to explain his interest in Taviana, and then asked the woman he was speaking with her name. "My name is Julia, and I had no idea that Taviana was a descendant of Duccio. I learned about some of his paintings in an art class taught by Taviana at the University of Milan. That's where we met and quickly became friends." Julia had, by now, searched David Wade on her nearby laptop to confirm his identity, profession, and reputation. Wade delicately continued the conversation and pressed lightly with his questions, hoping not to extinguish this precious source of information. "Are you a full-time student?" "No, I work in fashion, but I enjoy learning about art." He sensed she wanted to share more info with him, so he said nothing and waited. "The morning of her murder, Taviana left a sealed package for me at my home. With all that has happened since, I opened the package only this morning, having forgotten about it." She stopped, waiting for Wade to say something, but he did not. Julia considered her options, then continued. "The package contained a small box and simple written instructions from Taviana, asking me to keep the box for her until she retrieved it, or to open the box inside the Siena chapel if anything happened to her, and not disclose the existence of the box to the police under any circumstances." Siena Chapel? Exclaimed Wade. That's where Duccio placed his famous Maesta altarpiece. He quickly explained as much as he could about the chapel to Julia. Can all this interest in Duccio be a coincidence? Wade asked. I think not, Julia responded. How can it be? Julia confirmed that she had not volunteered any of this information to the police when questioned the day after the murder, or since. Having access to Taviana's cell phone account, the authorities asked Julia to check for messages, but she found none. She then forwarded Taviana's incoming calls to her phone, thus explaining why Jen had reached her when calling Taviana's number. Not wanting to comment on the legalities of Julia's actions regarding the police, Wade instead tried to convince her that he was willing to fly to Milan and accompany her to Siena. Julia accepted Wade's audacious offer, feeling somewhat secure at not having to travel to Siena on her own. Okay, send me your flight info and I will meet you at the airport. When the conversation ended, Wade yelled towards the outside of his office. Jen, book me on the next flight to Milan. Chapter 6. Wade boarded his direct flight to Milan from LaGuardia Airport in the city's borough of Queens, an area he knew well, having once dated a girl who worked and lived there. It was a contentious courtship, hard on the ears. She was a door slammer. Relationships can be noisy. He was apprehensive about spending the next 8 hours seated in coach. Last minute, Jen had not been able to book him his usual choice for first or business class. He always preferred premium seating for the many obvious reasons, but he especially appreciated the spacious legroom. Standing over 6 feet tall, standard seating meant his knees would be pressed and constantly knocking against the frame of the bolted armchair in front of him. Every reclining move of the passenger ahead would be felt by him. At least Jen was able to secure an empty side seat, allowing him to place as many books, documents, and portable computer for the long voyage. He intended to research and deepen his knowledge about Duccio, the Maesta, Siena, and the woman he was about to meet, Julia Cartier. Books spread across his lap, Wade's focused reading made the tedious journey to Europe's boot pass quickly. He was awakened from his work-induced trance only when told by a flight attendant that the plane would be landing shortly at Milano Malpensa International Airport. Julia had sent Wade basic personal info about herself and a snapshot in order to help him identify her at the terminal. In addition, Wade had extensively researched her online and found that she was a celebrated fashion designer and entrepreneur. At only 29, she had made a name for herself in Italy, despite being a North American. Following the usual disembarkation, customs, and immigration formalities, Wade wasted no time in exiting the terminal. He rapidly recognized Julia standing in the front row of the cordoned-off waiting area. Upon approach, he was pleased by her svelte figure, rich dark hair, classic facial features, and chestnut brown eyes that sparkled with intelligence. He had expected her to be fashionably dressed and was not disappointed. Julia had been waiting for Wade at the airport's overseas arrival terminal, expecting to greet a good-looking American in his 30s, if the online photos did him proper justice. She approached Wade, mentally decoding his physical appearance in mere seconds. His tall, broad-shouldered frame suited his thick blonde hair and masculine face very well. Despite finding many online photos of him wearing fine-cut suits with elegant ties, the casual attire and running shoes he wore betrayed his American preference for comfort when traveling by air. Mr. Wade? Yes, I am Julia Cartier. Welcome to Milan. Cartier? As in the jeweler? No, the explorer. She grinned. You can call me David. May I call you Julia? Of course. How was your flight? Not as bad as I'd feared. Not bad at all. They politely smiled at each other as Wade followed her outside towards a bright red Italian convertible sports car. A Ferrari, with the hazard lights flashing, temporarily parked in front of the terminal. As they drove away, Julia spoke first. "It is a 4-hour drive to Siena. We can stop to eat if you are hungry. If not, I suggest we drive straight through. We will arrive late, but I have booked us 2 rooms near the chapel. We can go to the church tomorrow morning." "Do you have the box with you?" Wade asked, hoping to lay eyes on it. "Yes, it is securely packed in the trunk." "Have you opened it?" "Of course not," she replied starkly. "I intend to respect Taviana's wishes. Anyway, the box is locked and I do not have the 4-digit combination." "What do you mean?" asked Wade incredulously. Julia answered while keeping her eyes on the road. "Taviana's instructions were clear. The combination would be revealed to me inside the chapel." "How?" Wade persisted. "That remains to be seen," Julia concluded. Wade accepted her answer, for now. He supposed the box could be forced open if necessary. Chapter 6, Part 2. Much of the next 2 hours were spent in small talk about each other's lives, as mile after mile passed beneath their wheels. Wade enjoyed asking short, pithy questions to people with the aim of learning as much as possible about them. He had mastered this technique by watching his favorite interviewer on C-SPAN, who always made the interview about the guest and not himself, unlike other celebrity network personalities who always seemed to talk more about themselves than their guests or topics. Julia shared her interest in history with Wade, but also her frustration when trying to place important events chronologically in a timeline. "What came first?" she asked rhetorically. "The Roman or Greek Empire? The American or French Revolution?" Wade understood what she meant, having encountered many smart people with the same problem. He knew it was difficult for countless individuals to establish in their minds the sequence of historical dates on a linear scale. Julia listened as he explained his passionate disagreement with the prevailing and popular mantra of avoiding boring dates when teaching history in schools. He was convinced that dates were the key tool in better understanding the evolution of human history. To this end, he regularly suggested to chronologically challenged folks, such as Julia, to remember one important date per century, thus allowing the mind to better situate other significant dates within the context of their proper epoch. "For example," explained Wade, "the Maesta was created in the early 1300s. My trigger date for that century is 1348, representing the arrival of the Black Death on mainland Europe. This devastating plague created a series of economic, religious, and social upheavals, which had profound effects on the progression of European and world history. Societies before and after 1348 were profoundly different. Each century, going back thousands of years, has at least one pivotal date worth remembering." Julia liked what she heard and asked Wade to relate several of his pivotal dates for other centuries, which he was pleased to share. He loved to talk history. The city of Siena was south of Milan. Midpoint on their trek brought them to the outskirts of Bologna, where they stopped for fuel and a stretch. Like planes, sports cars were not always kind to the long-legged attorney. Wade finished pumping the gas just as Julia returned to the car, having purchased a pack of gum and a bottle of hand sanitizer at the Autostrada 24-hour service station. He glanced at the massive city lights a half-mile in the distance. He had never been to Bologna and knew little about the ancient city, except for the fact that it was home to the oldest university in the world, Università di Bologna. As Wade prepared to slide back into the car, he noticed a sedan parked next to the service station's car wash. The sedan was enveloped in darkness, showing no sign of life, until he observed 2 immobile human figures inside. He thought this curious at such a late hour, and for a moment wondered if anything was wrong. "Are you ready?" asked Julia, sanitizing her hands. She was a bit of a germ freak. "Okay, let's go," answered Wade, re-entering her road-hugging machine. Julia had not yet accelerated to the full speed limit, when Wade noticed two glaring headlights growing with intensity in the rear-view side mirror. A vehicle was trailing them. As it caught up, he recognized the sedan he had seen just minutes before. It swerved towards them, made violent contact, and caused their car to skid and spin twice in the side road gravel before coming to a complete stop. As Wade regained control of his senses, he heard and saw the aggressor speed away. Luckily, he thought, there was no deep embankment for them to plunge into. "What happened?" Julia shouted. "Someone just tried to run us over," replied Wade. "They just tried to kill us." He instinctively turned to Julia to see if she was okay. He noticed a minor cut on her arm, red with blood. He turned away. He was not good with blood, and hoped she wouldn't notice. Chapter 7. The early morning rays of the Tuscan sun woke Wade from his light sleep. He had forgotten to close the window's heavy velvet drapes in his hotel room the night before. His exposed feet protruded from the queen-size mattress and its bedding. Length challenged European hotel beds. Annoying. He lay awake and mentally reviewed the film highlights of the past few days' events, with several rewinds of the harrowing incident of the night before. He jumped out of bed and stood in front of the room's bay window to perform his morning calisthenics. Wade was slim, physically fit, energetic, and generally healthy. He opened the long transparent voile curtains to reveal a spectacular view on the Duomo, Siena's beautiful medieval cathedral, his planned after-breakfast destination. "Good morning, Julia," Wade said as he greeted her in the lobby a few minutes before their agreed-upon 8 a.m. breakfast. "Sleep well?" "Not really, as you can imagine, but I am hungry." They sat in the hotel restaurant and ordered a simple Italian breakfast, or colazione. Cappuccino for Julia and fresh orange juice for Wade, who did not drink coffee, tea, or any other caffeinated beverage. Julia wiped the clean cutlery on the table with her napkin until it was cleaner. "I think it's time to call the police, Julia," repeating his plea of the night before. "No, I want to respect Taviana's last wish and not implicate the authorities." "Okay then, but promise me we'll reevaluate the situation as we move ahead," he stated in a serious tone. Julia agreed, then commenced eating. Wade read aloud from tablet notes he had compiled on the plane, describing their upcoming destination. The Duomo di Siena is a medieval church dedicated to the Assumption of Mary. It's a Roman Catholic Marian church, which are religious buildings dedicated to the veneration of the Mother of Jesus, the Blessed Virgin Mary. He provided more details, struggling with some of the Italian pronunciations, but Julia's sympathetic nods expressed comprehension. The Gothic cathedral itself was originally designed and completed in the 1200s on the site of an earlier building. The structure has the form of a Latin cross, a dome, and a bell tower. The beautiful dome rises from a massive hexagonal base with supporting columns. The gilded lantern atop the dome was added by one of my favorite artists, Bernini. Wade continued describing the church as they left their hotel and walked outside into the morning's fresh air. They advanced across the Piazza del Duomo with purpose and soon approached the cathedral. Their eyes lit up, confirming the popular consensus that the edifice, with its splendid facade, was one of the most fascinating in all of Italy and certainly one of the most impressive features in Siena. The interior and exterior were constructed of white and greenish-black marble in alternating stripes, with the addition of red marble on the frontage. White and black were, and still are, the symbolic colors of the city and were directly linked to the white and black horses of the legendary city's founders. Julia and Wade slowly climbed the front steps while looking up in wonderment at the building's impressive design. They entered the sanctuary along with other tourists at the designated area for purchasing guided visit tickets. After a short 5-minute wait, they joined a tour group and proceeded throughout the cathedral, learning much and seeing even more. Splendid artistic treasures adorned the church. Upon arriving in the chancel area, they were shown where Duccio's altarpiece had once stood on the high altar in the crossing, just under the dome. The tour guide explained what Wade already knew from his readings. The Maesta was no longer in the church per se, but now housed in the adjacent museum, to be viewed later in the tour. "Let's follow along until we get to the museum, then we can break away," Wade whispered to Julia, whose eyes showed approval. A few minutes later, the group came into the north aisle, arriving at the entrance of the adjacent Museo dell'Opera Metropolitana del Duomo, the gateway to the Maesta. Founded in 1869, the Museo is one of the oldest private museums in Italy. Julia entered the museum, clutching the precious small box in her jacket pocket, anticipating the imminent revelation of Taviana's secret. Suddenly, a hand gently grabbed her forearm, causing her to stop and turn around. Wade noticed Julia's abrupt movement and did the same. A silver-haired old man dressed in a black robe looked straight at Julia and spoke in a clear, heavy, regional accent. "Buongiorno, signorina. I have been expecting you." Chapter 8. Startled, Julia reached for Wade while he stared at the stranger garbed in a priest's attire standing next to her. "Is there a problem?" Wade asked, approaching the mid-sized gentleman wearing a Roman cassock, his classic garb suggesting membership in the Catholic Church. "No, signor, but I wish to speak in private to this young signorina. You are welcome to join us, signor." Julia looked at Wade, confused. Despite their apprehension, they followed the old man's lead upstairs, then through a side door marked "Private Office" in several languages. "My name is Father Umberto Omri," he declared in a soft voice, with a wide, friendly smile. His teeth were white and appeared to be real. They had entered a vast room furnished exquisitely and decorated with beautiful paintings and artifacts. A gold-framed medieval map of the world hung behind a weathered, wooden russet desk. Wade noticed a framed photograph of the priest and other members of the clergy, most likely friends and/or colleagues. "I know who you are, and I know why you are here," Umberto resumed, looking directly at Julia. "That is why I wish to address you in private, here in my office. Please, sit down." They approached a round table of dark wood with chairs to match. Wade felt the texture of the furniture as he sat down and guessed it might date back centuries. He loved old, vintage furniture. He imagined the multitude of people, ordinary and consequential, that had graced these items over the years. "How do you know me?" Julia asked nervously. "And what do you want?" The priest, now seated, leaned forward towards Julia, again placing his hand gently on her arm. "I was a friend of Taviana's." As he spoke these words, his smile receded. "I want to tell you about the Maesta." Shocked, Julia turned to Wade and he to her, but they both said nothing. Over the past few years, Taviana often visited this museum to view and learn about the Maesta altarpiece and her ancestor, Duccio di Buoninsegna. I, being knowledgeable about such things, gladly offered my aid and slowly developed a profound friendship with her. One could almost say that we became platonic kindred spirits. The priest's smile returned to his pleasant, weathered visage. "But Taviana never mentioned you to me," Julia said, shaking her head. "I know," replied the priest, "and she only revealed your existence to me the morning of her tragic death." "I don't understand," Julia responded while still shaking her head. Umberto explained. "Taviana contacted me a few days ago in a nervous state and told me she was in danger. She said if anything untoward happened to her, I should expect her best friend to visit our church. She gave me your name and suggested I examine the many online photos of you. My colleagues and I have been scouring the church and museum ever since, hoping to find you." "But why?" Wade asked in an impatient manner. The priest turned and addressed Wade directly. "To tell Julia about Duccio, the Maesta, and Taviana's quest for the missing panels." Wade was stunned by what he heard. If Taviana was also searching for the missing panels, was this the reason for her murder? And what did it all mean regarding his safety? A dramatic silence fell upon the trio, soon interrupted by the sound of a tenor bell and multi-language announcement on loudspeakers that somehow penetrated the priest's thick oak office door. Apparently, it was past noon, and the church and museum complex was closing until 3 p.m. for the midday riposa, or siesta, not unusual to Europe's Mediterranean countries. Posa pranzo was deeply ingrained in their national culture. Wade knew that Italians attributed the riposa to the heat in the middle of the day, which could get extreme in summer, combined with the large intake of food at lunch, their most important meal. Simply put, people got drowsy in the heat after a big meal. Italians embraced this biological fact as part of their natural clock, napping when their body said to nap, believing Americans were out of tune with their natural rhythms. At the completion of the announcement, Wade chuckled to himself, imagining his grandfather's pontifications on the matter. He could hear him clearly state, "This is nonsense. It's astonishing and discouraging that breaks of this kind during the work week are still permitted in countries unable to compete effectively in the modern global market. No wonder Italy was forever in financial trouble, along with its other southern Euro neighbors." The priest had looked up upon hearing the announcement. "Good," he said. "In a few minutes, the museum will be empty, save for us. Have you ever seen Duccio's masterpiece in person?" They both shook their heads. "Well then," he declared with an air of anticipation as he stood and smiled jubilantly, "let me now introduce you to La Maesta." Chapter 9. Father Umberto led Julia and Wade a few steps from his office to a temperature-controlled room on the first floor of the museum, home to the magnificent altarpiece, the true jewel in the Museo's crown, an undisputed freestanding masterpiece of early 14th century Italian art. The Maesta was not displayed in its reconstructed state. Instead, its parts hung on the four walls of the gallery, allowing for better viewing of its visually rich story panels. The room was dark, but the masterpiece was well lit. Julia and Wade slowed their pace as they approached the huge main frontal panel. Their final slow-motion steps signaled respect, awe, and reverence. Umberto stopped close to the composition and turned with his biggest smile yet. "My friends," announcing with a grandiose hand gesture, "I present the Maesta." Although his captive audience consisted of only two, Umberto assumed an air of stateliness and dramatic piety. Maesta is Italian for majesty. It refers to Mary, the mother of Jesus, enthroned in majesty as Queen of Heaven. At the end of the medieval era, Mary had taken on an enormously important role of intercessor between God and mankind, bridging common folks to Christ, giving normal people access to Jesus. The faithful would pray to the Virgin, and she would perhaps speak to her Son on their behalf. The cleric paused. He took a moment to solemnly lay the palm of his right hand over the plain wooden crucifix hanging around his neck and laying upon his upper chest. As you can see, this altarpiece is composed of many individual paintings, 65 in total. The biggest and most impressive of the 22 front, or recto panels, presents a large enthroned Madonna, garbed in traditional, intense, ultramarine blue. Mary is holding her child, surrounded by a court of angels and saints. A predella depicts scenes of Christ's childhood, separated by images of Old Testament prophets. Many biblical saints are also presented next to Mary on the frontal section, along with Siena's various patron saints in the foreground. The priest dug into his side pocket and retrieved a cross-shaped laser pointer with one of his aged spotted hands. He directed a sharp beam towards letterings around the base of the ornate marble throne. The laser's small red dot targeted the inscriptions. 2 short prayers asking the Virgin to grant peace to Siena and glory to Duccio, who has painted the scene. Umberto translated aloud. Holy Mother of God, be thou the cause of peace for Siena and life to Duccio, because he painted thee thus. Clearly enjoying himself, he stopped, allowing his guests to soak it all in, then continued. The reverse or backside has the rest of a combined cycle of the lives of both the Virgin and Christ presented in 43 small scenes. As you may be aware, unfortunately, several panels are now lost. Tilting his head to one side, Umberto proceeded. Though it took a generation for its effect to be measured, this masterwork set Italian painting on a course leading away from the static representations of Byzantine art towards more direct presentations of reality. Umberto looked directly at Julia and Wade. It is important to know that medieval art glorified God, not the individual. Duccio introduced a warmth of human feeling, subtlety, and delicacy, while maintaining a conservative inclination towards the elegant grace and decorative beauty of late Gothic art. He added beautiful modulations of light and shadow to his 3-dimensional compositions, moving steadily and deliberately towards creating real volume, weight, and substance. His subjects are informally animated and display real character, piercing awareness, and fully conscious wisdom. The priest began slowly walking around the room while speaking. There developed a mystical side to Sienese art, characterized by an emphasis on miraculous events. Duccio was a lyrical painter with lyrical qualities who paid less attention to dreamlike coloration, proportions, and distortions of place and time. This unique style settled into what we today call the Sienese school of painting, which flourished during the early and mid-Renaissance, for a time rivaling the more liberal city of Florence and its naturalistic art. The eventual political and economic decline of the city and its subjugation by Florence arrested the development of Sienese painting, but helped preserve a good proportion of Sienese works in public buildings and churches. Our city's treasures were thus not discarded or destroyed by new paintings or rebuilding. That is why Siena remains a wonderfully well-preserved late medieval town. As the trio deliberately moved from panel to panel, Julia and Wade continued to marvel at the beauty of it all, with Wade sharing a thought out loud. I've seen this artwork many times in books and online, but nothing compares to seeing the original pieces in all their glory. I agree, concurred Julia, staring at the pictures while twirling her hair in an inviting manner, as if being courted by a romantic suitor. Umberto regained their attention and resumed his teachings. Chapter 9, Part 2. Umberto regained their attention and resumed his teachings. Creating this huge 5-meter-high altarpiece was an arduous undertaking. Before painting, it was assembled from many wood panels bonded together. The construction was large and had to be painted on both sides, since it could be seen from all directions when installed on the high altar at the center of the sanctuary. Duccio used tempera paint made from finely ground dry pigments, egg yolk, and water, a permanent fast-drying painting medium. Tempera paintings are very long-lasting, and this was a primary method of painting until the late 15th century when it was superseded by the invention of oil painting, a slow-drying medium that allowed for changes, corrections, and touch-ups, as well as flexibility and depth of color. Please tell us about the missing parts, Julia asked, without moving her gaze from the images. Well, shrugging as he prepared to explain, the altarpiece remained in place until the early 18th century, when it was dismantled in order to distribute the pieces between 2 altars. When the altarpiece was taken apart, the painting was damaged in the process. As you may know, the dismantling also led to pieces going astray, either being sold or simply unaccounted for. Extant remains of the altarpiece, not in our church, are divided among several museums around the world. Here is a list of the panels and a chart of their positioning. Umberto handed them each 2 loose sheets of paper from the inside pocket of his robe. Before telling us about the missing panels, Wade began asking, I'd like to learn more about the historical characters Duccio chose to include in this painting. Using his pointer, Umberto turned back to the altarpiece. Very well. As mentioned, the center of the main frontal panel depicts the Virgin Mary, seated on a magnificent throne draped in beautiful embroidered gold, holding the baby Jesus on her lap. Kneeling before the Madonna, on the right to the throne, is Saint Crescentius of Rome, holding an iconic silver cross. During the persecutions of Christians by Roman Emperor Diocletian, he was beheaded at age 11. His mortal remains were transferred to our cathedral in 1058. Then comes Victor, the patron saint of Siena, holding a similar red cross. He was an Italian Christian soldier killed in Roman Syria during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. Standing between them is John the Baptist with raised hand pointing towards the Virgin. After him is St. Peter with a book, and St. Agnes of Rome holding a medallion inscribed with a lamb, as the Latin word for lamb is Agnus. Umberto pivoted to the left side of the painting, directing his red laser beam to another of the city's patron saints kneeling in the foreground. This is Bishop Ancinous, called the Baptizer, who used to christen the inhabitants of Siena and was tortured and beheaded by order of Diocletian. The priest solemnly lowered his head, made a sign of the cross, and upon completion, kissed the tip of his fingers. Next to him is the 4th and final patron saint of our fair city, Sabinus. Duccio represents this martyred bishop on his knees, grasping a bright red cross with both hands. Why is his crucifix bright red? Asked Julia. Actually, he is holding a cross, not a crucifix. A crucifix is a representation of a cross with a figure of Jesus on it. As for the bright color of the cross, it is simply to distinguish it from the darker red color of the background robe. Holding a cross indicates the saint is a holy martyr. However, the red cross generally represents victory over evil and death, while the white cross usually stands for the holy cause of Christianity. The erudite priest signaled his need for a brief pause as he wiped his brow with a lily-white handkerchief. He was not fading. Instead, he seemed re-energized by the purposeful attentiveness of his tiny audience. Now, he resumed, this is John the Evangelist, pointing to a bearded old man holding a book, standing between Ancinous and Sabinus. Next to him is St. Paul with the sword of his martyrdom, and St. Catherine of Alexandria holding a martyr's palm branch. Above the row of angels on each side of the Madonna runs a frieze depicting half-length figures of Christ's apostles. Above the apostles are pictorials that focus on Mary's life, while the crowning panels depict angels with Christ at the center. Throughout this fascinating and vivid presentation, Julia and Wade listened, analyzed the artwork, and often referred to the paper notes given to them by the knowledgeable churchman. Umberto excused himself for a moment in order to retrieve 3 small bottles of water from his office. Upon his return, they each took a moment to quench their thirst, with Julia drinking the most. She inserted the half-empty bottle into her jacket side pocket and met with resistance. Taviana's box. Her thoughts instantly turned to the mysterious contents held within the container. Soon, very soon, she told herself, it will no longer be a mystery. Chapter 10. Father Umberto Omri was a member of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, a Roman Catholic order of religious men founded in 1534 by Saint Ignatius of Loyola. Known for its evangelization, as well as its educational, cultural and charitable works, the black robes were once regarded as the principal force of the Counter-Reformation, and later a leading agent in modernizing the Catholic Church. In 2013, Jorge Mario Bergoglio became the first Jesuit pontiff, taking the name Pope Francis. As a young Jesuit clergyman and one of God's soldiers, Umberto's ordination to the priesthood followed his successful academic studies in theology and educational administration. His subsequent long and fruitful career as an itinerant minister eventually brought him back to the city of his youth, Siena. For the past decade, he had enjoyed his wide-ranging functions at the cathedral, especially those involving the museum's art collection. Let us now move on to the episodes on what was originally the reverse side, the verso. Resuming the tour, Umberto guided his two students towards a side wall to view the back panels of the Maesta, hanging adjacent to the frontal section. This side of the altarpiece was intended for privileged spectators in the presbytery, who could get closer to the paintings than the common faithful who congregated in the front part of the church. As mentioned, the verso originally numbered 43 panels in total. The central section, with 26 scenes from Christ's Passion, contains stories from all four Gospels. The crowning panels depict scenes after the resurrection. The pictures of the predella depict Christ's miracles and temptation. Umberto paused, cleared his throat, and then proceeded. The panels on the reverse, or Christ side, clearly demonstrate that Duccio borrowed from Byzantine art, with its recognizable facial features, gold leaf backgrounds, and traditional religious scenes, but was more experimental and expressive. "Look at this," the priest suggested with sincere glee. These pictures are full of warm color and beautifully observed details. Notice the figures, tessellated with ornamental fabrics and fine jewels. Duccio's use of modeling, the play of dark and light colors, reveals the bodies underneath the heavy drapery, which, under his brush, became more delicately rounded and three-dimensional. "Over here," he pointed towards another panel with genuine delight. "Here, we see a new, complex arrangement of figures, breaking down the strict lines of Byzantine art. Duccio was one of the first artistas to place figures in architectural settings. He examined and investigated space and depth like few before him." The priest shuffled his feet and began animating his arms with exuberant passion. Human beings and heavenly figures were largely indistinguishable and interchangeable prior to Duccio's generation. Duccio is part of an artistic revolution. His characters are unique. They interact with tenderness and express real emotion. What Duccio gives us is no longer simply a quintessential vision of the Son of God and the Madonna, but instead a tender mother with her infant child. This was something new. Though he flirts with naturalism, his masterpiece still remains an object of celestial veneration with its exquisite colors, but one that is capable of highlighting not only the divine, but also the full palette of human emotions. The priest lifted his eyes upwards, as if addressing God directly. This is why the Maesta is a work for eternity. Much of what he heard and saw mirrored Wade's intensive research of the past few days. However, the priest's glowing presentation injected vibrancy and added new meaning to his dry readings. Julia, on the other hand, experienced all of this in a very different manner, having not accumulated, consumed, and digested the same amount of beforehand knowledge as her partner in this adventure. What about the missing upper panels?" she demurely asked again. The priest ran his fingertips through his sparse silver hair and readjusted his robe, exposing the curved outline of his midriff, suggesting that he was soft in the middle. Perhaps his appetites extended to the culinary as well as the artistic. "The lost frontal main crowning panels," he answered assertively, "which originally formed the central apex of the upper section on the Madonna side, are thought to be paintings of the Assumption, and coronation of the Virgin. The lost central crowning panels on the reverse side are probably Christ's ascension and glory. Umberto stopped, suggesting his exposé was at an end. The silent atmosphere present in the almost vacant museum suddenly struck Wade. Julia continued to roam the hall, viewing the masterpiece at different angles, totally immersed. The priest suddenly became preoccupied with his small palm tablet. Wade took advantage of this distraction to step closer to Julia and whisper, "I think it's time to open the box. Do we open it with the priest?" She looked straight at Wade and nodded yes. "Father," she addressed him gently, "we have something we would like to share with you." "I assume it is the box that Taviana gave you to open here today?" he said with a slight twinkle in his eye. "Yes," she responded with astonishment. "You knew all along?" "I did, and have been waiting patiently for you to bring it forth." Wade was not as surprised as Julia by the priest's admission. He had a feeling that the cleric's involvement in this affair was much deeper than so far revealed. Julia asked the priest, "Do you know what it contains?" "No, I don't. But Taviana said it was a family heirloom that was connected in some way with the Maesta. Although I had been helping her try to locate the missing panels, she always gave me the impression that she was holding back certain information, items, and secrets." "I suppose you know the 4-digit combination for the lock?" Wade confidently surmised. "Indeed I do," said the priest. "Taviana shared the number sequence with me." "All right then," Julia said with anticipation. "Gather round." She looked quickly from Umberto to Wade. Together, they formed a loose huddle as she extracted the small wooden box from her jacket pocket and presented it for all to see. "Here goes," she said, turning each of the 4 small metal combination wheels to match the numbers the priest volunteered as 2031. Immediately upon completion of the code, the 2 tight front latches on the box were loosed by Julia's delicate fingers, allowing her palm to grasp the top and lift the cover open, thereby exposing the container's mysterious contents for their impatient eyes to finally witness. Chapter 11. A beautiful gold medallion appeared, brought to life as it caught the beam of an upper floodlight and refracted brightly onto the eager onlookers. The lustrous yellow object shimmered and glowed against the dark velvet background of the box's interior. Julia drew a slight smile, while Umberto grinned from ear to ear. A pensive look shrouded Wade's face. Beyond the impressive metallic surface, the object revealed a design at its center. Julia was the first to interrupt the moment's aura with words. "What are those images? Is that a seal of some kind?" "Actually," Umberto murmured with reverent respect, "it looks like a family crest or coat of arms." "Whatever it is, it's lovely," she said, widening her Mona Lisa smile. All 4 inches round and half an inch thick, the precious article was much bigger than any coin. Wade gently lifted the medallion from the box's black cushion interior and brought it closer to his eyes to better examine the emblem imprinted upon it. What he saw surprised him. The enigmatic insignia contained a cross, church, tower, and other smaller marks indistinguishable to him at present. "We need a magnifying glass." "I have several in my office," said Umberto, turning in that direction. The trio filed towards the priest's open office door. Once inside, the cleric reached towards his lower desk drawer and produced 3 different handheld lighted magnifiers. Still firmly holding the medallion in his hand, Wade reached for the largest of the lenses. He grasped the smooth ivory handle and examined the item for what seemed like an eternity to Julia and Umberto. He passed it along first to Julia for scrutinization. Then the priest took his turn, closely inspecting the object in detail with careful and critical attention. "This is definitely a coat of arms or family crest of some kind," he pronounced. "I agree," said Wade, "and our first guess must connect it with Duccio." Umberto was already excitedly flipping through the pages of a large leather-bound book resting on a shelf near his office window. He spent several minutes perusing the volume before opening another tome, then another, and another, scanning their contents. As the priest searched for an answer using Gutenberg technology, Julia was online, searching in the way she knew best. Wade said nothing and remained standing while continuing to examine both sides of the medallion intensely. He then reached for his phone, took several photos of the item from various angles, and transmitted the pictures with instructions to André Barthélemy, whose unique expertise in genealogy and heraldry was now badly needed. During the next 2 hours, they did not leave Umberto's office. They executed different forms of research, but worked as a small team, a triumvirate. They only paused when food and beverages, ordered by the priest, arrived in the benevolent hands of 2 elderly hooded nuns. The trio ate and drank as they worked. They talked little and read a lot. They each seemed isolated in their solo worlds, except for brief moments of communication when one of them occasionally made a comment, shared info, or asked a question. As mid-afternoon came and went, and the sun no longer plunged through the narrow office window, they sat together around the priest's meeting table and shared the results of their respective research, without finding satisfaction. Their caucus was suddenly interrupted by the sharp sound of Wade's mobile device displaying a short text message from Barthélemy that he read aloud. "Mon ami, I found it." Chapter 12. André Barthélemy sat at a blue work surface, shaped like a picnic table on the rooftop of his home, which overlooked La Rochelle's harbor, opening into a protected strait, the Pertuis d'Antioche. His magnificent view stretched over waterways that ultimately led to the Atlantic Ocean. He enjoyed doing most of his work under the shade provided by the freestanding terrace Brise Soleil he proudly built with his own hands and tools a few years back. His wife of 40-odd years was more of an indoor person, but not Barthélemy. He often fell asleep in his deck chair and was awoken by seagulls and the sunrise. With the arrival of computers, online databases, and the help of a small army of loyal aides and associates accumulated over a lengthy career, this retired, short, rotund man in his early 60s rarely left his modest ocean paradise. His moon face was partially covered by a long, white, flowing Santa Claus beard, reminding Wade of old American Civil War veterans in fading ambrotype photographs. A perennial, weathered Indiana Jones-style hat crowned his bald, round head. He talked loudly and laughed even more loudly. His French accent was mild when speaking English, but Wade enjoyed teasing him for his pronunciation of Shakespeare's language. Barthélemy usually responded jovially to this teasing by retorting that, as an American, Wade himself needed to properly learn the bard's tongue before casting any stones. Barthélemy was appreciating his afternoon constitutional, a smooth cognac, in his favorite balloon sniffer, when his computer screen sprang to life, signaling an incoming video call, only minutes after sending a tantalizing missive to his Yankee friend. "Bonjour, maître," were his first words as a close-up image of Wade appeared on his indispensable electronic companion. Barthélemy enjoyed using the French word maître for attorney or lawyer when addressing his friend. Wade also enjoyed the term, appreciating the exotic dignity the foreign word shone on him and his profession. "Good afternoon, André, and thanks once again for working so fast." "My pleasure." He never asked Wade his whereabouts or motivations for contacting him. He was given a task and expected to provide detailed answers and information on the quick. "What have you got for me, André?" "Well, the photos of the medallion you sent were quite revealing. You are correct, it is indeed a family crest of medieval Italian origin." Upon hearing this, Julia and the priest looked at each other with anticipation, expecting the voice emanating from Wade's device to announce an obvious direct connection with the Duccio clan. To be more precise, Barthélemy continued, after taking a small sip of his drink, this coat of arms originates from the 14th century, the early 1300s. This time it was Wade who felt a shiver as he readied for confirmation of his hunch. Go on, André, go on. It is most fascinating, mon ami. The insignia on your medallion represents the family of a great man, a great Italian pre-Renaissance painter, a master of the high Middle Ages, and, by the way, one of my favorite painters. Wade shifted in his chair, as he was not accustomed to this type of elongated prologue from Barthélemy. Julia and the priest hung on every word. The family connected to the image on your medallion is that of Giotto. Giotto? Wade exclaimed, eyes widening, as Umberto stood up and Julia put both hands to her cheeks. Yes, Giotto, repeated Barthélemy with a satisfied smile. Giotto di Bondone. Chapter 13. The French academic's pronouncement traveled from La Rochelle to Siena, landing with a mind-boggling thud. Although the trio in the small cathedral office were well aware of the northern Italian painter and architect from Florence, the first in a line of great artists who contributed to the Renaissance, they never expected Giotto di Bondone's family to be connected with their precious object of attention. Following his shocking announcement, André Barthélemy detailed the major biographical events in Giotto's life, most of which were already well known by Father Umberto. Barthélemy made it clear that he was only able to identify the image on the medallion and not the provenance of the item, its monetary or historic value as an heirloom or antique, and the date of its creation. For that important info, Wade knew that he would have to consult other Denary team members. Wade thanked Barthélemy, ended the conversation, and turned to Julia and the priest. What do we make of this? Dead silence. What's our next move? Deader silence. Wade stood up and began to pace the room. Julia pondered aloud as she poured herself a glass of water. Is there a connection between these two men? Is there a connection between their families? The priest mimicked Julia and poured himself a glass, cleared his throat, coughed, then took a sip of water that was no longer cold, but still cool from the melted ice. The two maestros were contemporaries. Giotto worked and lived throughout northern Italy, including Padua, Florence, and Bologna. Duccio, on the other hand, was principally a man of Siena, clenching his teeth in frustration as he finished. Wade, still pacing, asked the priest if Giotto had any connection with Duccio's Maesta. Not a direct connection, he answered, but his most influential work, the interior frescoes of the Scrovini Chapel in Padua, were viewed by Duccio and greatly influenced, some say inspired, his creation of the Maesta. Wade stopped moving. In that case, we need to listen to what this medallion is telling us. I agree, said Julia. We need to go north and follow its path. You're right, agreed Wade. All roads now lead to Padua. Chapter 14. The priest put his caring hands on both their shoulders, then gently wished them luck in their quest and Godspeed. They exited the building into a courtyard that led to a cobblestone side street that ran along the museum complex. Sunlight, by now, had turned to dusk. Julia walked ahead of Wade as he looked down at the uneven paving and noticed her comfortable-looking footwear, thinking, sensible girls wear sensible shoes. They eventually emerged in the piazza and walked among the tourists towards their hotel to gather their meager belongings and check out. As they left the lobby and emerged into the cool evening breeze, they noticed red and blue flashing lights on police and ambulance vehicles stationed in front of the cathedral's museum side entrance. Instead of heading to the hotel car park as they had planned, they instinctively walked towards the powerful blinking lights. They infiltrated the commotion and noticed one of the hooded nuns that had brought them sustenance during their time in the priest's office. She was crying. "What is wrong, sister? What has happened?" asked Julia. "Oh, Signora," she wailed. "Tragedy has visited our church." She wiped tears flowing down her cheeks. "Father Umberto has been killed." Wade took a step back with a jolt, while Julia grabbed his arm tightly with a gasp. "What?" he reacted with a loud whisper. "What?" repeating his disbelief, mind racing at high speed, trying to comprehend what had just been heard and process its implications. Julia frantically convinced the nun to lead them into the cathedral to learn more. Despite the immediate area being cordoned off by the authorities, the sister led them to an alternative side door further back, behind a massive column. They soon found themselves again in the museum, but were unable to enter the priest's office because of the multitude of first responders crowding the entrance and the room itself. As they watched the intense action unfolding in front of them, another nun approached. She hugged her religious sister and then tearfully related to them the gruesome details of Father Umberto's death by shooting, after an apparent struggle and ransacking of his office. Upon hearing this, Wade immediately thought of Taviana and her similar violent end. Talk of blood did not bother Wade, but seeing it did. He preferred staying clear of the murder scene. Both Julia and Wade walked away from the sisters to another part of the museum not far from the Maesta. They briefly discussed the situation and rapidly concluded that they would inevitably be questioned regarding their long presence in the priest's office that day, and might be detained as well. Wade told Julia that it was now time to tell the police everything, but was again surprised by Julia's adamant resistance to the idea. "This is all getting too dangerous, Julia. We need to get the police involved with what we're doing and tell them what we know, including the medallion." "No, David. We need to leave now. Now." She took his hand and tugged him towards the same door they had entered. Wade let himself be led, thinking that perhaps she was right in avoiding entanglements with the authorities. As they headed for their exit, they took one last look at the Maesta montage, focusing on the location of the missing panels, convinced more than ever that they needed to solve the puzzle and find the lost parts, albeit now for completely different reasons. Chapter 15. As Wade and Julia stepped outside the church, they both looked to their left and noticed the commotion around the museum's side door had now doubled, with media and onlookers added to the fray. They instinctively turned right and quickly advanced, hugging the stone wall of the edifice in the hope of disappearing, undetected. Their directional choice led to an alternate path that brought them back to the piazza and their original target, the hotel car park. They did not run, but walked in a brisk manner, looking straight ahead. Wade grabbed Julia's shoulder from behind and stopped her. "What's wrong?" she said, breathing heavily, more from anxiety than the effort of their quick pace. "Don't look, but the car that ran us off the road last night is parked in front of the hotel garage, and two men are standing beside it. One has black hair and sunglasses, and the other one is wearing a dark, scruffy baseball cap." "We can't go there," Julia declared, preventing herself from turning to confirm what Wade was describing. "Let's leave my car, grab a cab, and go to the train station." Wade nodded and immediately hailed one of the many passing taxis working the busy tourist area. The cab driver, obviously proud of his basic English, did what most hired drivers do in Italy. He filled the travel time with local history orations. "Ah, Stazione Ferroviaria di Siena. Yes, yes. It is very beautiful. Opened in 1935 by Mussolini. Yes, he made the trains run on time," laughing and enjoying his own story. Wade half listened to the driver, but noticed that the vehicle was heading downwards from the hilltop, away from the old city and cathedral. The ride lasted only a few minutes before they arrived at a massive concrete building, typical of El Duce's symmetric architecture. Wade paid the driver and quickly headed towards the entrance with Julia close behind. Arriving at the ticket counter, Julia employed her fluent Italian to inquire about the next train to Padua, known as Padova in the native tongue. She learned that the last train for today was leaving in 10 minutes, but it was the day's slowest, with 2 brief stops along the way in Florence and Bologna. Although Wade could not understand the conversation, he nonetheless placed several bills of currency on the metallic counter in front of Julia, which she gave to the teller in exchange for 2 first-class tickets. The teller pointed to the left as Julia thanked her. Wade followed his determined companion to the correct platform entrance and train. European trains were fast, efficient, clean, and on time. Millions of students had discovered the wonders of the old continent with unlimited discount youth rail passes, including Wade on his grand tour years ago. They boarded the streamlined silver and red Trenitalia train. Arriving at their assigned rail car, they noticed that it was almost empty. They sat a few moments without comment, and then began to make themselves comfortable for the 4.5-hour journey. Julia stood and removed her waist-length black leather jacket, but did not place it in the upper storage compartment, instead folding it onto her lap, thus ensuring that the treasured box inside would remain close and secure. The train departed smoothly, in a reassuring manner. Wade shared a nonverbal look with Julia, then turned and stared straight outside from his aisle seat. As the train gained momentum and left the station edifice, he noticed a dark sedan drive into the parking lot. He stretched across Julia's lap closer to the window. He strained his neck to avoid losing sight of the vehicle, made difficult by the advancing train, but was not too far gone to catch a glimpse of 2 familiar men jumping out of the car and racing towards the terminal. Chapter 16. Hewitt Fothergill was born to working-class parents in the modest South Yorkshire village of Rawmarsh. His youthful academic brilliance and distinctions earned him invitations and scholarships to England's most prestigious schools. His successful time at Harrow led him straight to Oxford and finally to Cambridge. He surprised many when he refused several history department teaching positions at preeminent European institutions, choosing instead to return home and accept a professorship at the University of Sheffield. Over the past 20 years, he never once regretted his bold decision. Now, in his mid-40s, he was content with his calm bachelor life, stimulating campus contributions, and the steady research challenges sent to him by the charismatic founder and leader of Denary, David Wade. This evening's challenge involved 2 prominent Proto-Renaissance masters, painters that dominated their era and were still worthy of praise to this day. Hewitt reread Wade's request, received a few minutes ago. Hewitt, I need to know any and all connections between Giotto and Duccio and/or their families. I arrive in Padua in 4 hours. Please rush. The short time frame given to Hewitt by Wade was not unusual. Being part of the Denary group, or Team Denary as Wade sometimes called it, added spice to the professor's quiet off-campus existence. Although he did not know the identity of the other 9 members of Wade's club, and never fully understood the complete picture or extent of his leader's projects or undertakings, Hewitt's tasks were always unambiguous and succinct. David Wade had recruited him in person following an overseas lecture given by Hewitt at one of Wade's alma maters, Columbia University in Upper Manhattan. Denary? What's Denary? Hewitt had asked Wade, both seated at a nearby coffee shop. Denary is Latin for 10, Wade had explained. Denary is my team of experts, and I want you to be part of that team. The rules are basic. Denary members must always be available, work fast, never go beyond their mandate, stay focused, loyal, and correct. In other words, never be wrong. Get the job done. The hour-long coffee shop conversation convinced Hewitt that Wade's intentions were legitimate, legal, and financially beneficial. Since joining, Hewitt-Fothergill's contributions to the group's many successes earned him substantial payments from Wade that were well appreciated by the modestly salaried college professor. Although Hewitt led a simple life and was not a spendthrift, his only indulgence being season tickets to all of Sheffield's professional football clubs, he appreciated the security his Denary money gave him. His love of football, or soccer, as Wade annoyingly called the sport, was unconditional. He reveled in the yearly drama of his city's teams and proudly pointed out, to anyone who would listen, that his favorite childhood team, Sheffield FC, was founded in 1857, making it the oldest club now playing association football. Hewitt worked with focused calm and ease that evening. He moved gracefully from his table computer to an extensive specialized book and media library to various communication devices strategically placed near his main working desk. He did not have an office, per se. His bachelorhood permitted him to use the entire house and every room therein as an office. He loved this privilege and considered it one of the many joys of being the sole master in his humble abode. He did, however, share his living space with a feline character by the name of Swan. Despite the distinctive cat odor embedded throughout the house, Swan was an ideal companion and all Hewitt required. After spending his days surrounded by vibrant young people on campus, Swan was his faithful, unassuming buddy at home. Hewitt advanced in his research, accompanied by the cliché British beverage he so loved. His ever-present teacup was never far from his lips, and Swan occasionally stole a sip in stealth-like manner. When reading in bed, however, Hewitt would forego his favorite tea leaves, instead finishing the day with a soothing scotch and water. As the hour approached midnight, Hewitt sent Wade the conclusions of his labors. He had provided his team leader with all relevant information connecting the two great medieval artists. One fact stood out and might, he imagined, generate consternation on the receiving end. David, attached is the info you asked for. By the way, did you know that Duccio engaged in witchcraft? Chapter 17. Throughout the rapid train trip to Padua, Wade worked non-stop while Julia slept most of the way, exhausted from the turbulent day's events. Not wanting to doze off, she fought the urge to slumber. Wade realized Julia had lost the battle when she laid her head involuntarily on his shoulder for a minute before regaining awareness and reclining her seat in submission to the inevitable. Wade's concentration had momentarily been broken by Julia's actions, distracted by the pleasant fragrance of her perfume or hair shampoo. He was not sure. After sending his instructions to Hewitt-Fothergill upon leaving Siena, Wade had also contacted other members of Denary. Face-to-face in-person meetings with team members were rare for Wade. He preferred to interact with his people via technology, thus saving time and effort by avoiding physical displacements whenever possible. He nevertheless always wanted to know where the group members physically were at all times. To this end, Denary members were required to install a tracking app or program in a portable device that remained on or near their person 24/7. This allowed Wade to know their location and therefore judge what type of communication was best according to distances and time zones. On this day, he noticed that 2 associates were in his vicinity, and he intended to meet with both of them. He first contacted his talented jet-setting auctioneer, appraiser, and authenticator of historical objects. Based in Tokyo, she was, by chance, spending the day at Sotheby's Gallery in Florence. Mariko Shimada had worked for Christie's auction house in Manhattan during her 20s, but recently accepted a high-level post with Sotheby's fledgling Japan location. Her responsibilities kept her on the road most of the time, often in Italy. Mariko's maternal great-grandparents met right after the end of the Second World War in Tokyo. Her American GI great-grandfather was stationed in the Japanese capital following the surrender. His frequent visits to what was left of the downtown area brought him into contact with a beautiful young Japanese girl who spoke English fairly well, a requirement for the government job she held. When her great-grandfather was discharged from the army a year later, they got married and decided to stay in Tokyo instead of moving to the States, like most of the other mixed-marriage post-war couplings. Although Mariko's mother suffered the stigma of being the descendant of an Ainoko, or Hafu, meaning half-breed, she never passed on that hurtful legacy to her daughter. When the train made its scheduled 15-minute stop in Florence, Mariko was at the station ready to jump aboard and join Wade in the first-class compartment. They sat a few rows behind Julia, who was still sleeping. Wade showed the medallion to Mariko, having gently taken it from Julia's coat pocket without disturbing her. Mariko examined the object closely for several minutes, took many photos, and then disembarked seconds before the train resumed its course. Little was said between them, for Mariko instinctively understood what Wade wanted and needed from her, and Wade knew that she would send him her conclusions as soon as possible. Chapter 17, Part 2. The train's next brief stop at Bologna Central, the city's railway station, went smoothly, in contrast to their frightening highway incident at the edge of town the day before. Wade was reflecting again on the harrowing drive-by collision when his video phone received an incoming signal from Denary's scientist, James Felix. He again moved away from Julia before answering. "Hi, Dave. How's life in the fast lane?" "Always interesting, Jim," Wade smiled. "How's life on the beach?" "Wouldn't know. Haven't been in ages. Too busy." "Working on your next creation?" Wade asked, hoping to entice James into revealing the latest invention he was developing. "Yep, and I need some money to buy some new toys. Got anything for me?" Wade paused before he answered, gently biting his lip in a show of concern. James was not asking for a loan. He never did. Whenever he needed money, he wanted to earn it. "Not right now, Jim, but I can front you some dollars against your next job." "No thanks, Dave. I was just asking. By the way, did you get the stuff I sent you last week?" Referring to a few new gadgets, specifically designed for Wade. "Sure did," replied Wade, masking his enthusiasm. He loved the new gizmos. James was a young man so full of ideas that he seemed to give birth to something new every day, including the customized satellite signal amplifier for the Denary tracking app Wade relied on. James Felix also loved music, 20th century music. His tastes were eclectic, showcased into Wade's ears during every video call. Today, the background soundtrack to their conversation was the John Denver classic, Country Roads. On other recent occasions, their chats were accompanied by the tunes of Sinatra, Elvis, the Beatles, ABBA, Journey, Prince, and Soundgarden. James never seemed to repeat his musical choices, thereby anointing himself, in Wade's eyes, despite his youth, as the ultimate old-school audiophile. Having studied, trained, taught, and worked up and down the American West Coast, James spent most of his time these days in his UCLA, Santa Monica, Marina del Rey Golden Triangle, where he worked and lived. He was a tall, handsome, sandy blonde California kid with a roundish baby face, cheek dimples, and hair always down below his ears. He grew up loving everything science and was passionate about becoming an inventor. His heroes were Edison, Archimedes, and Da Vinci. "Hey, Jim, I'm in the land of Da Vinci," declared Wade. "Is that right?" said James, pushing away his neglected overlong bangs from his eyes. "Well, tell him I said buongiorno and to keep up the good work." "Will do, Jim. Take care." Wade laughed to himself as he returned to his seat next to Julia. He resumed his research and readings about Giotto, the new enigmatic character in this swiftly unfolding drama. He learned that most of the master painter's life was shrouded in mystery, tradition, and legend. One famous story tells of the Pope's search for the best painter in Italy. When asked for a drawing which would give the Pope some idea of his competence and style, Giotto reached for a brush dipped in red paint and parchment. He then closed his arm to his side to make a sort of compass of it, and in one even sweep scribed a perfect circle. Impressed, His Holiness understood the achievement and gave Giotto an important commission. As they rolled into the outskirts of Padua, Wade turned his thoughts to Hewitt, anxiously awaiting info from Denary's crack historian. Proof that Wade was often simpatico with his team, his device illuminated, announcing the reception of Hewitt's message and info. Duccio was engaged in witchcraft? Wow, that's amazing, Wade thought. What next? The high-speed train's swift journey to Padua was coming to an end, just as Julia awoke. She stretched one arm and looked back at Wade with half-closed eyes. Still drowsy, she heard the voice on the PA system announce the train's arrival in Padua and looked again at Wade. Did I miss anything? Wade smiled with a soft chuckle. No, nothing at all. Chapter 18. While disembarking the train, Wade informed Julia that they would be met at the station by one of his colleagues who would drive them to a hotel and accompany them to the Scrovigni Chapel the next morning. The second member of Wade's team that was in his vicinity that day was a young red-haired woman from the Emerald Isles. She was only a 30-minute drive away in Venice, which found itself within the Italian region of Veneto, like Padua. Wade had asked her to rent a vehicle, meet him at the station, book 3 hotel rooms, and accompany him the next morning to the chapel, after which she would be free to return to her activities in the fabulous City of Canals. "Who is meeting us?" Julia asked, wanting clarification. "Firebird," Wade responded nonchalantly, expecting a delayed, confused reaction from his slowly awakening companion. "What? Who?" "Firebird," he repeated with more gusto. "Her name is Firebird, and you'll soon understand why." Stazione di Padoval is the main station serving Padua, situated in Piazzale Stazione, north of the city center. Wade disembarked the train into a cavernous passenger yard. Although built in the 1840s, he was not touched with a sense of impressive historic architecture, as he was in Siena. He asked Julia if she was all right. Upon receiving confirmation, he walked forward hesitantly, not knowing which direction to take. His tentative advance gave Julia time to put on her jacket, shielding her from the brisk midnight air. Suddenly, they heard a female voice nearby call out Wade's name. They both turned in the same direction and laid eyes upon a young woman whose remarkable physical appearance fully awoke Julia and Wade's smile. Julia looked up and down the tall, gorgeous redhead walking towards them in a black leather jumpsuit, high heels, dark nail polish on toes and fingers, topped by a long mane of natural bright fire-red hair. Julia was impressed. The young woman carried nothing except an ignition transponder key in her left hand. She reminded Julia of a sexy, sultry comic book character whose name did not come to mind. "Hey, girl," Wade greeted her with kindness in his voice. "Hey yourself, Blondie," she responded teasingly with a slight emerald accent in her speech. Wade introduced Julia. The redhead glanced towards her and asked, "Cartier, as in the explorer?" "No, the jeweler." Wade smirked. After a polite handshake, they followed Firebird towards the exit and a waiting SUV. As they approached the vehicle, Julia noticed that Wade had walked in back of the red and black bombshell, looking straight ahead, lost in his thoughts, instead of enjoying the slinky view right in front of him. Oh well, she thought, he's all business. Why Firebird? Julia asked, knowing she was not the first to make this inquiry. My father called me that. I don't remember him ever calling me anything else. Satisfied, Julia did not pursue the matter and would wait patiently for Wade to eventually explain Firebird's talents and mental abilities, and how these attributes would be of aid to their cause. Arriving at the hotel, the trio agreed to meet for an early room service breakfast in Wade's suite to discuss the matters at hand, preferring to go their separate ways at such a late hour and get some rest and alone time. The elevator stopped for Firebird at her floor, then continued up for Julia and Wade. They both walked down the corridor and realized their rooms were facing each other. Before entering, Wade turned to Julia. Firebird is an art historian, curator, and restorer from Dublin. She is also an expert at detecting forgeries. When it comes to art, sculpture, paintings, engravings, you name it, she knows her stuff. Julia said nothing, nodded once, then entered her room. Wade's mobile device buzzed just as he was closing his door. He quickly took off his shoes and sat down on the bed. He turned to his device and saw several files attached to a short message from Mariko. David, the medallion was created in the late 13th, early 14th century. I hope this helps. Mariko. Chapter 19. Style-conscious Julia noticed everything fashion about people. It was her profession. She had studied at a prestigious fashion school in Montreal, the city where she was born and raised, the city that she loved. Her time working as a young designer in the second largest French-speaking city in the world brought her to Europe each spring. Along with her boss, she visited most of the fashion centers searching for new haute couture trends and making contacts with others in the industry. It was during one of those visits that she was approached by a top design firm in Italy's fashion mecca, Milan. Although it had been difficult leaving her family and friends in Canada, Julia Cartier's career was her priority. She quickly found success in Milan, learning the Italian language rapidly and absorbing its passionate culture with equal ease. This morning, her eagle eyes turned towards Firebird as the confident redhead entered Wade's room to join them at the appointed hour. Firebird knew not to be late. She was clad once again in leather from head to toe, a light brown pelt hair retainer, chestnut high-heel shoes, cocoa polish on fingernails and toes, and a short, form-fitting amber dress with a matching cleavage-exposing push-up bra. Her carefully planned coordinated outfit impressed Julia, although she could not fully understand why. The only non-brown color displayed by this mysterious leather-clad femme fatale, other than her flame-red hair, were her striking glacial blue eyes. Julia knew that blue eyes and red hair form the rarest combo on Earth. Most natural redheads have brown eyes, followed by green or hazel shades. Knowing such things helped Julia match clothes and accessories for photo shoots and pictorials. Wade, on the other hand, did not take notice of Firebird's attire, instead simply acknowledging her arrival and inviting her with a hand gesture to sample the food platters set up by the hotel staff on upright trays. Julia joined Firebird in examining the contents of the large round plates. Nothing hot, all cold. They both chose reasonable portions of fresh fruits, muffins, and pastries, then sat at the table ready for Wade's discourse. Have you arranged a private viewing of the chapel? Wade asked Firebird, taking a sip from his full glass of cold orange juice. Yes, someone is expecting us at 8 a.m. She looked at the digital clock on the night table. In about an hour. Wade acknowledged the info, then turned to Julia and asked her to produce the medallion. Firebird had been apprised of the situation by the e-dossier Wade had sent her the day before, but she had not yet viewed the medallion and was curious to see and touch the object. Julia's arm reached for her jacket that was draped over a couch next to her and produced the box from one of the side pockets. She placed the container on the table and slowly opened it to reveal the shiny metallic object. Firebird surrendered a smile, for the first time in Julia's presence. She reached into the box with her slim, manicured fingers and delicately grasped the golden, round, solid figure. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Magnificent." "And it's been authenticated to the late 1200s, early 1300s, Wade stated, finishing his morning beverage in one last gulp. "Contemporary to both Duccio and Giotto." "Authenticated?" Julia asked, feeling clueless. "By whom?" "Never mind that," Wade answered dismissingly, not wanting to explain Mariko's role. "It was authenticated." Firebird shifted her blue eyes from Wade to Julia with the hint of another smile. She assumed the authentication had been performed by a Denary team confederate. Wade advanced the meeting by turning to Firebird, who was still admiring the medallion. "What can you tell us about our visit this morning?" She placed the valuable object back in its resting position. "Giotto's Padua chapel is located 10 minutes from here. We'll drive. As mentioned, I've secured a private visit for us. The chapel custodian will let us in, but then we are on our own. No guide or expert is available for us." "Have you ever visited the chapel?" Julia asked. "Yes, many times, but this morning I'll be looking at the masterpieces differently." Satisfied, Wade stood and began pacing near the window. "Okay, let's recap. We need to find a connection between Giotto and Duccio, and I have a hunch that the connection will be found at the chapel." Wade stopped in his tracks and stared at Firebird. "I don't know what we're looking for, but that is why you're here." "I'll do my best," said the redhead. "Now let's go." "Wait," Julia ordered while looking at her mobile device. "I've just received an odd text message warning us about our chapel visit." "From who?" Wade asked, leaning and placing both hands on the table. Julia answered without emotion. "The message is simply signed Martini." Chapter 20. Who's Martini? Wade ignored Julia's question, internally processing the warning and the messenger's name without flinching. Why was his New York client contacting Julia? Had he obtained Julia's identity and personal info from his aide Jenny, who was holding down the fort in Manhattan? Impossible. Jenny would never do such a thing. Despite the time difference, he dictated a text message to his available at all time executive assistant, knowing that he would wake her with his urgent question. She responded 1 minute later, confirming his belief that Martini had not contacted her. "I'll take care of this," Wade told the women. "However, let's be on alert this morning. All eyes open." Unfazed, Firebird led them both out of the room towards the elevator. Julia followed, less confident, but without further questions. The trip to the chapel was all a blur to Wade. His thoughts were elsewhere, trying to comprehend the latest developments and assemble the pieces of this ever-widening affair. During his office meeting with Martini in New York, he was not warned by the older gentleman of any dangers. Wade was under the impression that his mission would be a great challenge, but not dangerous. Who was behind the incident on the highway to Siena, and who killed Taviana and the priest? Was Martini behind these deeds? Was there a connection? Was he the instigator, pulling the strings? He had asked Jenny to do a thorough identity search on his mysterious client following their initial meeting in his high-rise office. But having paid his fee in cash and only given his surname and phone number, she had little to investigate. Wade was not surprised when Jenny found nothing on him or his New York area device number, most likely an untraceable burner phone. He grabbed his cell and tried Martini's number, but was met with the standard non-availability message. Having hit a mental barrier, he decided to refocus on the morning's task ahead. As they approached the freestanding chapel, Wade glimpsed at the austere building against the glowing early morning Veneto sun. The modest edifice facade did not hint at the treasures that lay within. His mind pivoted towards what he expected to see inside, recalling his readings on the train the night before. The Scrovigni Chapel, now fully occupying his view and attention, was a church commissioned by the affluent Paduan banker Enrico Scrovigni, who, in the early 14th century, when Padua was a famous university town flush with trading money, purchased the land to have his luxurious palace built. A chapel annexed to it was also constructed to serve as the family's private oratory and funerary monument for Enrico and his wife. Money lending in the Middle Ages was considered usury, a sin in the eyes of the Catholic Church. Enrico Scrovigni's father had been reserved a place by Dante in his Inferno, leaving no doubt as to the prevailing attitude towards bankers during the Middle Ages. To counter this blemish on his reputation, Enrico may have built the private burial chapel to redeem the family name and their collective souls. Enrico Scrovigni commissioned the famous Proto-Renaissance painter Giotto di Bondone, a student of the master Florentine artist Cimabue, who died in 1302, to decorate his palace chapel. The simple structure is also known as the Arena Chapel, because it was built where a Roman arena had once stood. The small church was built in an area where sacred open-air processions of the Annunciation to the Virgin had been presented for a generation. The chapel was thus dedicated to Santa Maria della Carita at the Feast of the Annunciation in 1303 and consecrated in 1305. It measures about 69 feet long by 26 feet wide and 43 feet high to the vault. The interior is lit by natural light penetrating tall lancet windows on the south wall. There are no windows on the north wall, which was adjacent to the palace. The completed building, in all its humanistic and spiritual glory, accurately reflected the power and wealth of its patron. Arriving at their destination, Firebird parked in the lot adjacent to the edifice. Julia eagerly stepped out of the vehicle before the redhead had killed the engine. Wade was less anxious to leave the vehicle, instead taking time to look around the empty parking lot for anything peculiar or signs of trouble. He finally exited along with Firebird, who led them through an unadorned black steel gateway to a side door partially open, held by a small, wrinkled hand, inviting them to enter. Wade felt an unexpected rush of adrenaline as he stepped inside the ancient place of worship. Although not a religious man, he enjoyed spending 25 minutes every Sunday morning in the relaxed company of a young, non-denominational TV preacher from Houston, Texas, who delivered a weekly televised common sense message with a friendly, positive outlook on life. Religion light. Refocusing his concentration, Wade mentally downloaded all he had learned so far about this conundrum. He recognized that Firebird's time and talents were valuable. Therefore, he wanted to put every minute in the chapel to good use. He hoped that this privileged opportunity would advance his cause and bring him one step closer to solving the mystery. But as he entered the sanctuary, one thing overpowered his thoughts and kept flashing in his mind. Who or what is trying to stop me from finding the Duccio panels? Chapter 21. They entered the small chapel as if entering a grand cathedral. Firebird's custodian was an elfish old man with a mustache nearly as wide as his head. He was neither pleasant nor unpleasant, He simply performed his assigned duties and greeted them unceremoniously in what was obviously a rehearsed manner. "Welcome to Cappella degli Scrovigni," he said in a heavy accent with a growl. The diminutive gatekeeper closed the side door, bowed informally, and walked away casually down a dark corridor. The trio were left on their own. They stood at close proximity to each other, bathed in the splendid aura of royal blue light caused by the reflection and refraction of the ancient stained glass windows and decorated interior. The chapel air was cool, almost cold, for its lightly attired visitors. Julia was surprised to find the sacred edifice sparsely furnished. The lack of objects, high ceiling, and vast expanse resulted in an echo effect, sharply repeating the sound of each high-heeled step taken by Firebird upon the polished marble floor. Wade rotated in place, scoping the panoramic extent of the building's richly decorated interior walls. He had seen many pictorial representations of the artwork, but those facsimile images did not convey the overwhelming beauty his eyes presently witnessed. Firebird, who was now standing in the center of the chapel, began to speak. "Here on these walls is one of the supreme achievements of Western European art. Although Giotto di Bondone belongs to the Middle Ages, he is the most remarkable precursor to the Italian Renaissance of the 15th century. He is one of its greatest sources. We know the names of only a few earlier artists. Most remain essentially anonymous. With Giotto and his fame beyond borders, the history of art also became the history of great artists." "Wow," Julia thought to herself, impressed with Firebird's introduction. "This is going to be good." "The Arena Chapel became a necessary part of a European artist's education," Firebird declared. "A mandatory place of pilgrimage to experience the stylistic humanity, illusion of depth and perspective presented in Giotto's murals. Born around 1266 in Florence, Giotto was in his late 30s when he worked here. He and his team of about 45 collaborators labored 2 years to paint the chapel. Giotto frescoed the chapel's whole surface, including the elaborately decorated walls and the blue ceiling, representing the heavens above. A typical workday consisted of that portion of each fresco that could be painted before the plaster dried and was no longer fresh. This medium required speed and confidence." Julia recalled learning about the challenging fresh or fresco painting techniques in her art classes taught by Taviana. She especially remembered that Leonardo da Vinci badly miscalculated the effective use of this tricky way of painting when executing his iconic Last Supper in Milan's refectory of the Convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie. Instead of using tempera on wet plaster, true fresco or buon fresco, the preferred method of fresco painting for centuries, Leonardo tried oil on dry plaster, a method known as fresco secco. His experiment resulted in a more varied palette, which was his intent, but this method wasn't durable. Julia once visited the famous masterpiece with Taviana and was shocked at the deterioration, which had begun not long after Da Vinci had completed his iconic work. Firebird began pointing her elegant index finger to appropriate areas of the chapel. Giotto's fresco downward cycle, or spiral, is organized along 4 tiers, each of which contains brightly colored episodes from the stories of the various protagonists of the sacred history, which are the historical books of the Old Testament. The tiers are divided into frames with decorative borders, each forming a scene. The chapel is asymmetrical in shape, with 6 tall windows on the longer south wall. This form determined the layout of the decoration. The many sculptures, bands of marble, and ornate arches you see are trompe-l'œil painted architecture, not real, an optical illusion. Firebird continued pointing to specific areas of the church in accompaniment to her explanations. The cycle presents narrative scenes recounting the story of God's gift to mankind, salvation. It starts on the east altar wall with God's decision to reconcile with humanity, entrusting the archangel Gabriel with the announcement of his choice to forgive Adam's original sin with the sacrifice of his son Jesus. The narrative proceeds in a continuous cycle along the north and south walls with the stories of the Virgin Mary's life and Christ's time on earth, his death, resurrection, and ascension. As you can see, each subject is presented in vivid detail, including the famous scene painted on the triumphal arch of Judas receiving the money to betray Christ. Chapter 21, Part 2. Firebird paused, allowing her transfixed students to absorb the flow of information and view the exquisite images. The west wall or entrance door wall presents the end of history, the second coming and last judgment. This magnificent— Wade gestured for Firebird to stop. He slowly began to stroll around the chapel, reviewing the cycle on his own, while the girls remained in the center. He gravitated towards the betrayal depiction and gazed upon the scene for what seemed like an eternity to Julia, who wondered what had piqued his interest. Finally, Wade asked the women to join him in that part of the chapel. "Tell me about this section. For some reason, it reminds me of the Maesta." "Interesting," said Firebird as she approached Wade. "Although Giotto and Duccio both developed distinctive artistic styles, reflected through each artist's various inspirations and personal vision, certain similitudes in both works abound." Firebird reached inside her side pocket and extracted delicate HD projection e-glasses and put them on. She adjusted the eyewear and continued. "Now, let's make a close analysis of how each master portrayed the final days of the life of Christ, known as the Passion. By doing this, one is able to compare the ways in which they treated narration, composition, figures, tone, and space. For example, both artists included a scene of the betrayal of Jesus in their respective cycles of the Passion, yet each approach implies different compositional goals." She readjusted her eyewear. Also known as the Kiss of Judas or Christ's Arrest, Giotto's betrayal scene is focused intently on the main drama of Jesus and Judas, following a general compositional arrangement. Giotto limits his scene to fewer characters in order to emphasize human behavior and gestures, while Duccio uses groups of figures to portray the story and has added outlying incidents and minor details. "Are those glasses you're wearing projecting Duccio's betrayal scene?" asked Wade, with more than a touch of envy. "Yes," responded Firebird, with no hint of wanting to share her device. She proceeded matter-of-factly. "In the betrayal, both artists have used an array of lanterns, torches, staves, and spears to increase the chaos, energy, and the dramatic violent tension of Christ's arrest by the Romans. Yet Duccio has concentrated those props into one scene, whereas Giotto dispersed them throughout several episodes." Julia retrieved a high-definition image of the Maesta's betrayal panel on her tablet. She handed the device to Wade. Firebird glanced at Wade, then continued. "Okay, let's examine the different treatment of human beings in this scene by both artists. It's a very important point of comparison when investigating their approach to narrative. Notice that Giotto's large, classically inspired men appear dignified and noble. They stand firmly on the ground, anchored, tonally modeled in shade and light, broadly depicted and universal. Giotto drew all his figures and their postures according to nature, with weight and monumentality, giving us this full sensory experience. He explores his naturalistic goals through exploiting drapery in order to indicate the different forms of his figures. Julia continued to be impressed by Firebird's explanations, but was perplexed by the redhead's lack of emotion and cool demeanor in the face of such artistic beauty. Firebird soldiered on, encouraging Julia and Wade to move closer. Giotto's mural is to some extent dominated by Judas and his voluminous, deeply creased yellow cloak. The cloak all but covers the resolute figure of Jesus, who stands in profile, further emphasizing Judas's duplicity and the powerful, dramatic confrontation between the forces of good and evil. Duccio, on the other hand, explores drapery in a regimented linear fashion with sharp lines, rather than revealing the body beneath. His humans are graceful and thin, with elongated proportions, favoring somewhat contorted figures that elegantly float above the ground. Duccio has used tonal modeling with his characters, yet not to the expressive degree of Giotto's use of weight, bulk, and substance. Also, notice that Duccio presents Christ in a frontal position, unlike Giotto's profile stance. Were Duccio and Giotto friends or rivals? Julia asked. Not sure. That remains one of the great mysteries about these two contemporary geniuses. Wade's face lit up upon hearing the question and response. His brain had instantaneously produced a bolt of high energy that computed cognition. He turned to both his companions to announce his revelation. Good morning, Mr. Wade. The trio swung around to face someone who had appeared in the chapel without warning. Wade looked at the stranger as he approached, focusing on his familiar face. Mr. Martini? Chapter 22. Wade was flummoxed. Facing him stood a younger version of his client, wearing an informal light blue two-piece suit, white satin shirt without a tie. The man smiled, looked straight at Wade and declared, Yes, I am also Mr. Martini. By the way, my older brother sends his greetings. Wade ignored the pleasantries directed at him. I don't understand. Have you been following us? Only at a distance. But as you know, 2 men have been tracking you since you arrived in Italy. Do you know who they are? No, I do not. But I suspect that they mean you great harm, which is unacceptable. Wade tried to put this moment in perspective and gauge what was happening. Why are you here, and why are you following us? As expressed to you in New York, my brother strongly believes that you will find what we are looking for. To make sure all goes well and follow your progress, he asked me to shadow your movements in secret. But earlier today, I felt it necessary to warn you of imminent danger, and now I encourage you to leave this place immediately. Why? Julia asked impertinently, staring straight at the author of the ominous text she had received at breakfast. Because nefarious opponents have tracked you down and are headed this way. Signora, signora! They heard a voice moving towards them from the dark corridor and appear in the form of the agitated custodian. Signora! Due men outside with pistolas! Firebird grabbed the out-of-breath bearer of this sudden portentous news with both arms and spoke to him in Italian. The custodian immediately nodded and headed towards the east end of the chapel. Firebird signaled to follow him, which they all did at a quickened pace. The little man led them through a strategically placed door that was difficult to identify from a distance, having been decorated to blend in with the wall's mural. They filed through a well-lit narrow corridor leading to a cluttered back room. The custodian opened a nondescript wooden door leading them outside within running distance of the parking lot, now occupied by 3 vehicles: Firebird's rental, Martini's luxury car, and the familiar dark sedan belonging to their 2 pursuers. Without exchanging words or even a glance, the redhead embarked into her rental and sped away, while Martini guided Julia and Wade into his car with a ready driver and engine running. "What about Firebird?" Julia shouted with concern. "Don't worry, she knows her work is done. She's gone. It's us they want, not her." Martini sat himself in front of the car alongside his driver and tapped him on the leg, prompting him to take off. Wade turned his head, looked out the back window, and got a clear view of his stalkers running from the chapel to their parked vehicle, gun in hand. Martini's driver raced the streets of Padua, navigating the narrow lanes with skill. "Now what?" Julia asked. "Where are we going?" "Actually," Martini responded calmly, despite the excitement, "where do you want to go?" "Florence!" shouted Wade. "Take us to Florence!" Chapter 23. Martini's chauffeur continued showcasing his impressive driving skills, hooking left, then right, finally arriving at a forested area well within the city limits. The car swiftly crossed the tree-lined entrance into a wide-open circular area, shielded by the thick foliage. In the center was a glimmering, streamlined helicopter, resting on an octagonal launch pad. The vehicle stopped. Martini, Julia, and Wade quickly exited and streaked towards the rotorcraft. They embarked, taking the same seating positions as they had in the car, closed the doors, and secured their seat belts. Martini gave a thumbs up to the pilot, who already had the aircraft operating in standby mode. The chopper smoothly lifted from the helipad and gained altitude, exposing an impressive aerial view of the surroundings. Julia watched Martini's car successfully escape the wooded enclosure, just as the menacing dark sedan and its occupants entered the launch area, surely frustrated by the sight of the departing metallic bird. Wade was not well. The helicopter's body was filled with the loud noise of twirling propellers and powerful engines. His ears and brain were inundated by a whirlpool of sounds. The cacophony outside and inside his head was overwhelming. The pain was sharp, acute. He sat back. Closing his eyes would not help, and usually led to kinetosis, motion sickness. Julia paid no attention to him, instead choosing this odd moment to inspect the wound she sustained during their highway misadventure, thinking it might have healed sufficiently to warrant removal of the bandage. She gently pulled back the dressing on her arm, exposing the superficial laceration. The premature removal of the bandage caused the scab to break. The wound had not yet completely healed and began to bleed again. Wade noticed Julia's actions and now faced his twin foes, blood and noise. Bloody noise, he mused to himself, bloody noise. Once the whirlybird reached its desired altitude, everything stabilized. Julia rebandaged her wound. The occupants remained still and quiet for several minutes. Wade felt better. Martini was the first to move and talk. He reached back and gave his valued passengers each a headpiece equipped with microphone and listening device. "Can you hear me?" Wade and Julia each gave a thumbs up. Martini looked pleased and relieved. "This 4-seat turbine copter can reach average cruising speeds between 130 and 145 miles per hour, said Martini. "It should take us about 1 hour to get to Florence." Martini then addressed his pilot. "Make the landing arrangements." Hearing this, the pilot changed his communication channel to an external frequency, leaving his passengers to talk amongst themselves. "We've got to find out who those 2 men are," Wade declared in a desperate tone. "This might help," Julia said, handing Wade a smartphone. "What's this?" he said, grabbing the device with curiosity. "It's their phone." She smiled triumphantly. I took it from the front dash of their unlocked sedan in the chapel parking lot. When? Wade responded in amazement. Just as we were running to Mr. Martini's car. It only took a few seconds. Wade looked back at the phone with glee and spontaneously kissed Julia on the lips, startling her. He then looked out the window and began thinking. Why Florence, Mr. Wade? Asked Martini. Let me first sort some things out. I'll explain a bit later. This seemed to satisfy both Julia and Martini. Wade used the next 60 minutes to concentrate and explore the plausibility of his chapel revelation. He reviewed his accumulated case documentation, performed fresh research on his mobile, and contacted the newest and youngest member of Denary. Chapter 24. Rajiv, come for lunch. Time to eat. Barely 20, the young man rolled his eyes. Eating was a waste of time, especially when it interrupted the installation of a brand new multiple screen system for his custom-made hybrid computer. Okay, Mom, just a minute. His room was packed with an array of electronic devices and little else, except for his favorite upholstered chair and a small single bed. Sleeping was a waste of time, especially since recently joining Denary, a result of meeting David Wade at an Asian subcontinent high-tech symposium in his home city of Bangalore, the capital of the southern Indian state of Karnataka. Rajiv recalled boldly approaching Wade with nervous small talk, informing the American that the name Bangalore represented an anglicized version of the Kannada language name Bengaluru. At first, Wade was amused, but upon further investigation, he felt compelled to make this brilliant youth the final digit in Denary's two-fisted power punch. Rajiv Mohandas was born and educated in Bangalore, India's third most populous city. The metropolis is known as the Silicon Valley of India, or the country's IT capital, because of its role as the nation's leading information technology exporter. His Australian biological father had worked in the city's fledgling space industry. His mother was a Bangalore native employed in the same industry, working in human resources. His birth was the product of a torrid love affair, quickly followed by the tragic death of his young father. Rajiv and his mom remained in Bangalore, recently renamed Bengaluru. Rajiv excelled early on at school with computers. As a child prodigy, he fast became a celebrated local whiz kid, completing several university degrees by his late teens. He now hoped his recent chance meeting with Wade would guarantee him a reliable income. He lived alone with his working mother in a modest but comfortable house, in want of nothing. Rajiv's mom never asked him questions about his work or bothered him, except at mealtime. That was sacred. He was about to lift himself from his chair to join his mother in the small dining room when he noticed an urgent message from Wade. He read the text, joined his mother for a quick bite to eat, and then immediately returned to his command control center, the grandiose name he gave his modest workspace. During his short meal break, he had deliberated on Wade's request and devised a plan of attack. Now he was ready to work. Not long after liftoff, Wade had downloaded and transferred to Rajiv the data contained in the phone filched by Julia. Wade's instructions to Rajiv were simple. Urgent. Analyze tell data and identify owner or provenance. Urgent. Within 30 minutes of Wade's transmission, Rajiv decoded the data and sent Wade a plethora of benign information, with one exception. Most of the recent calls and messages to and from the device involved the Guardia di Finanza, an Italian police force. Chapter 25. The cloudless sky seemed limitless, inviting the morning sun to do its best. Wade had taken many helicopter trips over the years, but not all of them pleasant. Today's ride was in a first-class, 5-star luxurious machine. He appreciated the comfortable plush seats, adjustable headrest, and legroom. Martini handed out cold water bottles from a small laminated cooler that could also be used as a table when closed. The voyage was almost half over when Rajiv's message came in. Wade decided not to immediately share its information with Julia or Martini. He instead fired off instructions to Denary's international finance, currency, and banking expert in London, Nancy Burnell. She was a smart, short-haired former Olympic athlete whose toned body, Wade acknowledged, looked awesome in a business suit. Her mother was a black Kenyan Olympic champion who fell in love with a white Olympic official from the City of London. Although the social mores in England were evolving rapidly, mixed marriages in London were nevertheless uncommon at the time. Nancy, however, celebrated her dual heritage and prided herself on being the new face of modern Britain. She followed her successful career on the track with studies at the London School of Economics in her city of birth. She was a London girl through and through. She loved the metropolis and had insisted on finding her place amongst the city's international banking elite, which she had accomplished. Wade sent Nancy his usual pithy instructions, asking about Guardia di Finanza, whose name suggested obvious ties with Italian finance. He then turned his attention to drafting a much more detailed instructions message destined for another Denary lieutenant. He put more thought and time into this one, lifting his eyes from his tablet and sipping his water, even though he wasn't thirsty. Before he could finish his first draft, his smartwatch signaled the arrival of Nancy's message. He chose to read the text on his portable device's larger screen. Nancy described Guardia di Finanza as an Italian law enforcement agency under the authority of the Minister of Finance. Also known as the GDF, the agency is a militarized police force responsible for protecting the nation's legal economy and businesses operating in compliance with the law. Its activities are closely connected with economic, judiciary, and public safety issues, including financial crimes, counterfeiting, tax evasion, money laundering, international illegal drugs trade, smuggling, customs and border checks, illegal immigration, intellectual property violations, credit card fraud, anti-organized crime operations, terrorist financing, the maintenance of public order and safety, political and military defense of the Italian borders, and cybercrime. Wade was surprised at the extent of the agency's responsibilities and tried to figure out the connection with his pursuers. He explained what he had learned to Julia, hoping she might detect something, but no ideas were forthcoming. She was visibly upset, however, by this new information. How did this all get so complicated and dangerous? What exactly had Taviana been involved in? Wade returned to composing the instructions message started minutes before. The targeted recipient of this particular dispatch was perhaps the most clandestine member of Denary. Having never met or spoken to Sasha Kirov, Wade knew little about Denary's intelligence expert, other than Sasha was indispensable to him. Was Sasha man, woman, young, old? Mysteries aplenty. Wade had agreed from the outset to never inquire into such mundane details. He knew the basics and the bottom line. Sasha Kirov worked within the Russian Federation. All communications were electronic. As far as Wade could fathom, Sasha coordinated an extensive worldwide network of covert operatives with direct high-level access to state armies, police forces, militia groups, and national intelligence organizations like the CIA, FBI, NSA, MI6, DGSE, BND, CSIS, Mossad, SRV, formerly the KGB, and many other similar authorized and illicit agencies within the intel community. On the flip side, Sasha also had contacts with mercenaries, arm dealers, and terror groups. Sasha Kirov was probably a code name, perhaps belonging to a former Soviet spy. All Wade knew for certain was that she or he was a well-connected person, highly skilled and effective. For obvious reasons, Sasha was the only Denary member not trackable by Wade. In order for Sasha to execute Denary tasks properly, Wade would simply forward all pertinent information in written form. Sasha always came through, and Jenny never encountered any problems transferring fee payments to Sasha's numbered Swiss bank account. Wade provided his Denary colleagues the info they needed, nothing more. He never felt comfortable divulging the totality of a situation to anyone in Denary. This policy gave him ultimate control over its activities. He kept his people in the loop, but only with the information each specifically required to get their job done. This guiding principle served him well. Wade informed Sasha about the 2 murders, his sedan pursuers, the Guardia di Finanza, and his imminent arrival in Florence. His written message ended with a typical concise wrap-up. Sasha, contact all relevant Italian authorities with our story. Put them all on the same page and get them working with us, not against us. Chapter 26. As the helicopter approached Florentine airspace, Martini's pilot prepared to descend and focus on accomplishing a flawless landing. His passengers delighted themselves with a spectacular aerial view of one of the most beautiful cities in the world. Although internationally famous, Florence's population is relatively small, at about 400,000 inhabitants in the city proper, and 1.5 million throughout the greater metropolitan area. It is, however, the most populous city in the Italian region of Tuscany, attracting over 13 million tourists annually to its historic city center. As the descent began smoothly and without incident, Wade reminded himself that Florence, or Firenze as Italians and Julia called it, originated as a Roman city that later became a medieval city-state republic. A center of flourishing European finance, industry, especially wool, and trade, Florence became one of the richest and most powerful cities in Europe and the world for over 2 centuries. It is considered the birthplace of the Italian Renaissance and referred to widely as the Athens of the Middle Ages. Powerful forces shaped this political, banking, and cultural center, including generational rule by the enlightened, influential Medici clan, one of European history's most wealthy and important noble families. Starting from the late Middle Ages, Florentine money, in the form of the gold florin, and its banking families, led by the Medici, financed monarchs, wars, and the development of industry all over Europe. They similarly financed the papacy and the Renaissance embellishment of the Vatican and Rome. In 1530, the beloved republic was replaced by hereditary monarchy for the next 300 years, until Tuscany became a province of the unified Kingdom of Italy in 1861. During the second half of the 19th century, the population of Florence doubled, with a large and vibrant foreign community attracted by the romantic vision of the city. Firenze became Italy's capital in 1865, superseded by Rome 6 years later. During the Second World War, the city experienced a year-long German occupation. In 1943, Allied bombers targeted central Florence, destroying many buildings and bridges. During the Nazi retreat, however, Florence was declared an open city, thereby avoiding further war damage. In 1966, the Arno River flooded parts of the city center, damaging millions of rare books and art treasures. Volunteers from around the world, known as Angeli del Fango or Mud Angels, mobilized to help rescue the city's historic riches, inspiring many new methods of art conservation. As the helicopter hovered over Florence during the last stage of its descent, Wade honed in on the city's many World Heritage landmarks. He admired the Ponte Vecchio Bridge, straddling the Arno, the Basilica di Sante Croce, Italy's famed Parthenon, home to the nation's illustrious dead, Accademia Gallery, Bargello Museum, Boboli Gardens, and Pitti Palace. He recognized the Piazza della Signoria, Palazzo Vecchio, Uffizi Gallery, and the other impressive structures that house the many artistic treasures by Renaissance masters. He especially took notice of the stunning complex of buildings that make up Florence Cathedral on the Piazza del Duomo, including the freestanding Campanile, also known as Giotto's Bell Tower. Chapter 27. Having visited the city several times since her arrival in Italy and having worked there on occasion, Julia was especially thrilled by her bird's-eye view of the glorious former republic. Florence was an important city in Italian fashion, and Julia had made her stylistic presence felt on many of the city's premier catwalks. Despite her regular visits to Florence, Julia had avoided the city over the past year. Actually, she was avoiding one of its residents, a young Florentino model. Her thoughts turned to him during the last part of the helicopter ride. She had fallen madly in love with a man of Italian and Greek ancestry. During their fiery 6-month love-hate affair, she would often tease him as her sexy Roman or Greek god, whichever cultural trait demanded praise or vitriol at that given moment. She had met his large Florentine family only once, at a big famiglia wedding held in the city's high-end district. She knew it would and could not last, having broken her cardinal rule of never dating within her own profession. The breakup had been painful. Fresh memories continued to flood her mind until her body felt a small jolt from the landing of the aircraft on Firenze soil. Martini gave a final thumbs up to the pilot and led Wade and Julia towards a waiting limousine, long, low, and shiny, parked just beyond the landing zone. The uniformed driver held the door for his 3 passengers who rushed inside. The chauffeur raced off without asking for instructions. Wade therefore assumed that he had been pre-informed as to their next stop by Martini or Martini's people. The few seconds it took to transfer from the rotorcraft to the limo were enough to feel the effects of the midday Tuscan sun. Florence lay in a basin formed by surrounding hills, and since it lacked a prevailing wind, temperatures were higher than along the coast. In addition to the heat, the sun had another effect on their arrival. It lit up the buildings, exposing their unique richness of color, style, and architecture. Their vehicle advanced slowly but steadily through the traffic towards the historic center. Wade refrained from asking about their destination, but wondered nonetheless. He was not surprised, however, when they finally stopped in front of the Grand Hotel Duomo in the heart of the old city. "I have booked you each a suite with amenities for as long as is necessary. Good luck with your search." "You're leaving us?" Julia asked their benefactor. "Yes, but I was glad to help. Good day." Julia and Wade climbed out of the car and peered into the front window at Martini, who turned away from them and signaled the driver to leave. As the vehicle departed, Wade pondered their next move. It was high noon. "Well, now what?" Julia asked her companion with a deep sigh. "Let's check into our rooms, buy some toiletries and new clothes, get a bite to eat, and meet back in the lobby at 3. "What for?" demanded Julia. "You still have not told me why we are in Florence." "I know why," responded Wade. "And at 3, you will too." Chapter 28. David Wade enjoyed steaming hot hotel room showers. For some reason, he languished under the liquid spray and enjoyed the seething cascade of heat against his skin for much longer than when at home. Hot showers were well known as a good place to sing, but he preferred this secluded place and time for thinking. And thinking was exactly what he was doing. Thinking about Giotto's intimate connection with the city of Florence and how that fact could help him accomplish his mission. His post-shower shave and application of body care products, purchased at one of their hotel's high-end lobby shops, reinvigorated his physique and stimulated his mind. Wade cracked open a cold beer from his minibar, drinking while wearing his suite's complimentary thick, white bathrobe and comfortable slippers. He grabbed his mobile and sat at a table with the contents of his now emptied pockets strewn in front of him. He casually unfolded the 2 sheets of paper given to him by the priest in Siena. He re-examined their content, but noticed something new, something he had not previously seen. On the back of the second paper was a small reproduction of a circular bronze plaque filled with text. He surmised that the words were connected with Duccio and the Maesta, therefore probably written in Latin or Old Medieval Italian. His first thought was to show Julia and have her translate, but he changed his mind. Instead, he would send the text to a Denary acolyte, who would date and decipher the text in whatever language it was written in. He forwarded a close-up HD photo of the words along with instructions to Denary's language expert. He checked his tracking program to locate his linguist. She was presently situated in northern Africa, in the city of Rabat, Morocco's capital. Andalusia is not only the beautiful southern region of Spain where Wade's linguist grew up, it is also her name, which he often complimented her for. Many also complimented her magnificent exotic looks. Delicately slim, with light olive skin and long brown hair, Andalusia's striking beauty was enhanced by round amber eyes, aquiline nose, and a slight overbite that drove most men crazy. Born in Egypt, Andalusia was raised by a Muslim father of Moorish ancestry from the Iberian Peninsula, and a Hispanic mother from South America, a converso, reared in Christian traditions and beliefs. Andalusia was a child of United Nations diplomats. She used her intercontinental heritage to follow in the footsteps of her parents and become a respected language expert and translator for the UN. She traveled the world constantly. Wade branded her a UN brat, the ultimate world citizen. They had met near New York's UN headquarters a few years ago and had actually dated for a while before mutually agreeing that friendship and a working relationship would be preferable. Wade had convinced Andalusia, against her better judgment, as she so often reminded him, to join Denary and offer her special communication skills to the betterment of his business. Although her position with the UN brought her many advantages, money was not one of them. Working for Wade supplemented her bureaucratic salary nicely and satisfied her occasional lust for adventure. The best thing about Denary, however, was that it kept her in regular contact with a man she admired and considered a true dear friend. "Hi, genius." "I love it when you say that," smiled Wade. "Well, someone has to. Otherwise, you would be the only one." Wade laughed, enjoying seeing and hearing her again. "What are you doing in Rabat? Frolicking on the Moroccan beach?" "No, working. UN stuff." "Did you get the photo of the text I just sent you?" "Yes, but I haven't yet." Her phone rang. She looked at the caller. "I have to take this, David. I'll look at the text ASAP and get back to you pronto." The communication ended abruptly. Satisfied, Wade turned and gazed at the massive cathedral and its impressive tower filling his suite's rectangular window. Time to visit Giotto. Chapter 29. Julia Cartier closed her eyes and let the hot steam envelop her face. Like her partner in this bizarre adventure, she was simultaneously enjoying her own personal awakening, but for her, it was a hot bath that did the trick. While savoring this moment, her thoughts slowly drifted to her friend. Taviana was her only true friend in Italy, and now she was dead. Julia could still not fully grasp the harshness of this undeniable fact. She suddenly felt overwhelmed by grief. Her eyes swelled. Vulnerable and alone, she broke down and cried, her salty tears intermingling with the warm droplets of condensation on her cheeks. Regaining her composure, Julia redirected her thoughts to the present. Her short shopping spree with Wade minutes before provided her with basic necessities, new clothes, and a few personal treats. She was glad to wash her hair, having neglected it for the past few days. Jet black, straight, and slightly below her shoulders, it was usually pinned back, out of the way, but stylistically arranged. New cosmetics allowed her to redo her nails and apply basic and tasteful makeup to her doe eyes, high cheekbones, and full sensual lips. A new pair of cute, sensible earrings also helped lift her spirits. Her skin was pale, kept creamy white by religiously avoiding the sun. Although she was obsessed with fashion as a business and profession, she took a more measured approach with regards to her own attire. She always wanted to look her best, but did not exaggerate the time she devoted to her looks, having more important things to accomplish. Once dressed, Julia took the time to send her parents, who lived in Canada, a short mundane email letting them know that all was well with her. This was not a daily routine for Julia. Although she loved her parents very much, she was not one to contact them often, preferring occasional written messages to verbal exchanges. Communications by phone or video were rare. Julia was not comfortable with small talk, preferring to keep her conversations to a minimum and only when necessary. Her family back home struggled to accept and understand this about her, but Julia's one and only good Canadian girlfriend understood and never made Julia feel guilty about the lack of regular contact. Julia was not a loner, but she kept to herself more than most. The downside to this personal trait was that she had no support from others during difficult times. No one in her entourage was aware of Taviana's death, and no one knew that she was traveling around northern Italy on a dangerous mission with a New York attorney she had met just days ago. As Julia exited her suite and moved towards the lobby to meet Wade, she reminded herself that they shared the goal of this mission, but for different reasons. They both wished to find the lost Maesta Panels, but in her case, she hoped that doing so would help explain why her dear friend had been killed. Chapter 30. As planned, Julia and Wade met up at 3 in their posh hotel's main lobby wearing their newly purchased clothes. Wade was clad in a short-sleeve white polo shirt and jeans. Julia arrived wearing comfortable ankle boots and sporting a sleeveless, light mid-length summer dress, her otherwise bare shoulders covered by her faithful jacket. Both instinctively looked each other over, and both seemed pleased with what they saw. Julia put on new sunglasses as she followed Wade into the glaring Tuscan mid-afternoon sun. They felt the heat as they strode across the Piazza del Duomo, through the afternoon crowd of leisurely tourists and backpacking sneakers towards the cathedral complex. They stopped midway, next to a souvenir stall, and took in the impressive view of the church. Il Duomo di Firenze, known as the Cathedral of St. Mary of the Flowers, or the Basilica of Santa Maria del Fiore, is the main church of Florence. The building of the cathedral had begun in 1296 in the Gothic style and was completed structurally 140 years later with the dome engineered by Brunelleschi. The exterior of the building is faced with polychrome marble panels arranged in geometrical patterns in various shades of pink and green, bordered by white, with an elaborate 19th century Gothic Revival facade. The cathedral is one of Italy's largest churches and the largest brick dome ever constructed. In addition to the Duomo, the cathedral complex includes the baptistry of St. John and Giotto's Campanile, a freestanding bell tower. The bell tower, designed by Giotto in 1334 at age 67, is a tall, slender structure sustained by 4 polygonal buttresses at the corners, dividing the tower into 5 levels. When he died in 1337, Giotto had only finished the lowest floor, but the project was eventually completed 22 years later. Wade pointed to the tall structure, telling Julia, "Giotto died building that tower, and he is buried somewhere in this complex, but no one knows exactly where. I want to know where. I need to know where." Chapter 31. Julia, encouraged by Wade, began the daunting task of climbing the 414 steps to the top of the tower. They stopped at each of the levels, taking stock of the situation and retrieving their regular breathing rhythm. When they finally reached the summit, Wade reflected on the beauty of the structure, acknowledging that the master painter Giotto was also one of the founding fathers of Italian Renaissance architecture. Julia took in the wonderful panoramic view of Florence and the surrounding hills. As a historian, Wade surveyed the city from above with special pleasure. His imagination took over and channeled the spirits of its famous Renaissance inhabitants: Michelangelo, Raphael, Da Vinci, Donatello, Botticelli, Masaccio, Ghiberti, Vasari, Piero della Francesca, Cellini, Giambologna, Verrocchio, Ghirlandaio, Fra Angelico, Machiavelli, Savonarola, Galileo, Amerigo Vespucci, Lorenzo the Magnificent, and one of the first brilliant thinkers to transform Florence into the Italian Renaissance's bustling epicenter of creativity and sophistication: Giotto. Giotto di Bondone lived and worked at a time when an entire era was dying, that of the Middle Ages. As this old system was fading, it gave rise to the new, the birth of the Renaissance and the modern political state. The old spiritual certainties and paradigms were beginning to dissolve. Western civilization was experiencing an intense transformation, a profound shock to its system. Many European thinkers were becoming cognizant that much of their life on Earth extended to wider intellectual horizons that remained uncharted and unexplored. A deep evolution in human self-understanding was occurring, leading to a reinvention of the autonomous self. The medieval view of the world, where knowledge was largely accepted on authority from such ancient sources as the Bible, was giving way to a new approach: humanism. During medieval times, the world and the lives within it had been regarded as a preparation for the eternal life of the hereafter. Now, a revolution was taking place, a renaissance. A rebirth of knowledge from the classical epoch of ancient Greek and Roman thought was giving humanity a greater confidence in itself and its potential. New methods of painting, as well as advances in architecture, engineering, and knowledge of all kinds, were leading Europeans towards a more realistic and logical vision of the world, transforming both self-belief and self-consciousness. Instead of the spiritual dogmas of medievalism, the new outlook regarded the world and life from a more individualistic, human, and natural perspective. Renaissance humanist beliefs stress the potential value and goodness of human beings, emphasizing common human needs and seeking solely rational ways of solving human problems. Wade lifted his arms high, exhilarated. He inhaled the stimulating air of the city that had started it all. He relished knowing that he was presently surveying the place that had given birth to the modern conception of individuality. Satisfied with the climb's results, Julia turned to Wade, who signaled his readiness to descend Giotto's structure. As he was about to take his first step downwards, Wade stopped. He took a step back, crouched down, and faced the now familiar image. His gaze narrowed upon a small faded relief sculpture of Giotto's family crest chiseled into the stone railings below the metal security rooftop cage-like fence. Beneath the coat of arms was a weather-worn circular bronze plaque containing scribblings that also looked familiar. Upon closer examination, he noticed they were the same writings as those on the reverse side of Father Umberto's paper. He took out the sheet in question from his shirt pocket and verified the similitude of the writings. He was astonished to confirm the word-for-word reproduction. This is the same text sent to Andalusia for translation, Wade realized, now awaiting her response with greater impatience. Julia, he whispered forcefully, come here. Can you read this? She took a moment. No, she said after trying to decipher the language. I see some Latin and some Italian, but nothing I can read properly. It's probably written in an old dialect. Wade could understand what she meant. Shakespearean English was difficult to read and fully understand, but it could be done. On the other hand, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written earlier in Old Middle English, was incomprehensible to most Anglophiles. Wade snapped a photo of the stone words and grabbed Julia's hand to commence the descent. She turned to follow him when she noticed one of their sedan pursuers searching the rooftop's circular viewing area. She squeezed Wade's hand. He spun round and caught a distant glimpse of the man, the one wearing the baseball cap. They instantly let go of each other's hands and began frantically descending the tower stairs. They stopped at the first atrium they encountered, not to rest, but to make sure they were still descending together in close proximity. As they resumed their downward momentum, Wade's e-watch vibrated with a message from Andalusia. She had translated the priest's text, the words written on the circular bronze plaque. The Campanile text. Chapter 32. Having climbed the Campanile at the end of visiting hours, Julia and Wade encountered few tourists during the ascent. The descent, however, was more congested, with visitors who had arrived earlier, now leaving the complex. They kept a rapid and steady pace going down the bell tower, but were careful not to trip and fall or to collide with the site's departing patrons. Wade had decided not to stop and read Andalusia's translation, preferring to put some distance between them and their pursuers, assuming the capped man's partner was also on the roof. When they finally reached the ground floor entrance to the tower stairs, Wade surprised Julia by guiding her towards the cathedral building, instead of outside into the piazza and safety beyond. They entered the great basilica and moved towards a worn brown wooden bench, positioned behind a massive stone pillar. They sat to rest and evaluate the situation. Wade was convinced that their pursuers had followed them to the tower, but had probably not seen them descend or enter the church, where they now sought asylum. As far as he knew, with closing time only minutes away, they, along with the remaining tourists, would be ushered out of the complex at any moment. His goal was to find a way of staying in the cathedral beyond its evacuation. But first things first, he needed to read Andalusia's translation of what he now mentally branded as the Campanile text. Before reading, he quickly explained to Julia the importance of the words he had, minutes before, asked her to decipher atop the tower. He gave her Umberto's paper, allowing her the chance to again peruse the mysterious script. Wade was now ready to devote his full attention to Andalusia's findings. David, your guess was correct. The language of the text you sent is an early form of Italian spoken by inhabitants of Florence and its environs. It is a Tuscan dialect and the immediate parent language to present-day Italian. Although Latin was the principal language of churches and courts in the Middle Ages, a dead language that allowed the living to concentrate power in the hands of the few, writers began using their own language to compose their greatest works. The Florentine vernacular of the time descended from Latin. The oldest texts written in Florentine date back to the 13th century, with its literature fully blossoming in the 14th. Standard modern Italian is based on Tuscan, specifically on its Florentine dialect. It became the language of the literati and of Italy's culture thanks to Dante Alighieri's 1265 to 1321 Divine Comedy, Petrarch's 1304 to 74 Humanist Poems, and Orsini Boccaccio's 1313 to 75 Decameron. These writers pioneered, in their most prestigious works, the use of the vernacular instead of the scholarly Latin used at the time, giving their countrymen a literature of their own. It will later become the official national language, la bella lingua, the beautiful language, of all the Italian states and of the Kingdom of Italy when it was established in 1861. Well, enough history and background info. Here is the translation of the text. This tower stands as a monument and tomb to its builder. May his genius and spirit live forever within these walls and within the hearts of all men who believe in the grace and majesty of our Lord. Chapter 33. Tristan Valkyrie never pined nostalgically for the years spent as an academic at Germany's oldest university in Heidelberg. She much preferred working as a hired gun in the private sector for corporations in the transportation, infrastructure, mineral, and energy sectors. Whenever companies encountered potential archaeological sites during digs, they were obligated, in most countries, to cease work and call in professional archaeologists and historians to evaluate the site. Tristan Valkyrie was the first person most private developers contacted to appraise nebulous conditions and, if need be, coordinate all dealings and efforts with local, regional, and/or national government agencies. Her work allowed for travel throughout Germany and beyond. She was considered efficient, cost-effective, and respected by state and public heritage institutions. Working in the private domain gave her freedom and control of her schedule, influence in public policy, as well as earning power beyond college salaries and freedom from academic pressures to publish. Digging was in Tristan's blood. As a young university student in 1940, her father had been required to join the archaeological unit of the Ahnenerbe, Heinrich Himmler's Nazi Research Institute. Following the war, he completed his graduate and postgraduate studies, then joined Humboldt University of Berlin's teaching staff. There, he remained as a professor and bachelor for decades, until he married in his 60s with one of his former students, who shortly thereafter gave birth to a cute, robust, blonde baby girl full of energy, a strong character, and a wild spirit. As the child grew, her long, wavy hair darkened slightly towards light brown or dirty blonde, but her fervid disposition did not change in the least. Tristan joined Denary upon Wade's invitation some years ago, having worked closely with him on several jobs involving mutual clients. She liked everything she heard and knew about him, and he the same. Together, they were a duo to be reckoned with, and often brought each other onto their own respective jobs. This time, it was Wade who contacted Tristan with a question about the status of archaeological digs at the Duomo complex. She had built and maintained an up-to-the-minute database of past, present, and dormant digs worldwide. Displaying her usual Teutonic promptness, it took only minutes for her to respond in writing with precise information that fueled Wade's thought process. According to Tristan, a major archaeological dig in the crypt of Santa Reparata, beneath the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, was ongoing, but about to be shut down in 8 days due to lack of funds. Permission had been given 12 months ago to investigate unidentified tombs, but permission was not granted to open any of the tombs out of respect for their Christian burials. Although this was the information Wade needed, he nevertheless employed his speed-reading abilities, a self-taught skill he acquired during his last summer break working as a tennis instructor before commencing law school. He perused the remaining paragraphs of Tristan's text, learning the politics and economics behind the site's closure, as well as her opinion regarding the scholarly status of Giotto's burial place. Wade turned to Julia, who was glancing at his screen from an angle and following as best she could. He put his hand on her shoulder and spoke softly. "Let's go down to the crypt. Let's go meet Duccio's nemesis." Chapter 34. The crypt of Santa Reparata, named for the old basilica the present church was built over, was open to tourists as part of a general all-access ticket pass to the entire cathedral complex. At this late hour, tourists were prevented by 2 uniformed attendants from entering the crypt area. The few remaining tourists still present in the catacomb were slowly being ushered out by the same attendants. Wade leaned against the wall at the entrance to the crypt until the attendants were preoccupied with departing sightseers. Seizing the opportunity, he took Julia's forearm and led her past the distracted guardians into the fluorescent-lit stone chamber beneath the floor of the church. They quickly walked past several large information stelas and wound a path through ancient ruins, including the tomb of the cathedral's famous dome builder, Filippo Brunelleschi. The pair hastily maneuvered through many glass-enclosed displays towards the farthest end of the exhibition section. Now safely shielded from the entrance attendants, Wade looked for a nook or cranny that would allow them to remain hidden beyond closing hours. "David," Julia whispered, "look, the work area." She had noticed a placard hanging on the front of a metal-linked chain barring entrance to a dimly lit corridor, warning in Italian that access beyond this point was off-limits. Their eyes met in agreement. They gently stepped towards the opening, violated the protective chain, and skirted down the narrow stone hallway towards 4 tapered steps that led directly down into an open archaeological dig site. Chapter 35. Julia's adrenaline-fueled breathing was heavy as she negotiated the downward steps and stood with Wade in the middle of a working archaeological site strewn with modern equipment. Although absent of workers, it was obvious that the site was not abandoned or yet closed, as Tristan predicted would happen in a few days. The enclave was not cold and damp, as one would expect, but very warm and dry, most likely due to the portable dehumidifier, displaying its efficacy with a green light emitting diode and droning sound. Wade scanned the site several times, he made a mental inventory of its above-ground freestanding tombs and work tables, covered with documents. He encouraged Julia to examine the various inscriptions on the tombs, while he instinctively directed his attention to the different books and papers left by the workers. They reunited after a few minutes, their efforts having borne no results. "Experts believe that Giotto lies buried somewhere in this complex," Wade explained, "but his gravesite has never actually been found. Over the years, bones have been unearthed with some specialists connecting them to the master, but there is no definitive consensus on the whereabouts of his grave or remains. The actual location is still unconfirmed or in dispute. While some are convinced that Giotto's bones were recently reburied with honor near the grave of Brunelleschi, others are highly skeptical, including me. Also, if this excavation site, where we now stand, had found something about his resting place, it would have been publicly announced as an important discovery. But that has not happened. Therefore, we must assume that he's buried elsewhere." "But where?" Julia asked, joining him next to the work site map table. "And how is his tomb going to help us in our search? And why?" Their private conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of a mechanized male voice announcing the closure of the crypt to all tourists. The voice repeated the announcement several times in multiple languages. "Let's stay here until they close the crypt." "Are you crazy, David? We can't stay here all night." "We will if we have to. Anyway, we can't leave and go back to the hotel. It isn't safe." "David, before I agree to this, you have to tell me what you were looking for down here and how you think finding it will help us." "Fair enough," said Wade, about to begin his explanation just as the lights went out. Julia gasped, froze, and immediately thought to herself, "I'm locked inside an old crypt with dead people in pitch darkness. This is not a good thing. No, not a good thing at all." Chapter 36. The blackness added a chill to the air, most likely psychological, and not evidence of a sudden temperature shift. The couple stayed silent for a while, then began to hear each other breathe. Wade was the first to make noise. He shuffled his hands back and forth on the table, trying to connect with one of the portable light sources he had noticed on the work table. He found a battery-operated lantern and used his fingers to press any buttons or switches on the device. His digits met with success, triggering the illumination of the small chamber they occupied. The glow of the lamp yellowed his skin. Julia exhaled a sigh of relief and, half instinctively, walked up the 4 steps to peer down the long corridor towards the public crypt area. Her action confirmed that it, too, was enveloped in complete darkness, except for the dim residual hue of a red emergency exit light. "Are you okay, Julia?" Still displeased and dealing with their dire new circumstances, she replied affirmatively, without a hint of enthusiasm or kindness. "I'm sorry about all this, Julia, but I think we can make a breakthrough down here." Wade brought 2 folded plain metal field chairs close to the table for them to sit, and grabbed 2 nearby sealed bottles of water. Julia had her chair and beverage. Now she wanted Wade's explanation. "I'm listening," she said in a voice that seemed to regain its normality of understanding and gentleness. "Okay, here it is." Wade gathered his thoughts and relied on his talent for explaining things in a simple, direct, and coherent manner. "We know that there is an obvious connection between Duccio and Giotto. But what is that connection? Teacher-student? Friends? Artistic rivals? Enemies? If we can figure out what brought them together during their lifetimes, it might help us determine what has brought them together in death 700 years later." Julia perked up, listening intently. Wade continued. I've assimilated everything I have read, heard, seen, learned, and witnessed about these two men, their art, and the little we know about their lives. I think history has underestimated their connection, ignoring their artistic rivalry and, yes, personal hatred. Julia's eyes widened. Wade leaned forward. Giotto was the greater artist of the two, with earlier fame and reputation. I believe that he tried to derail a younger, up-and-coming competitor by somehow being involved in serious accusations against Duccio. What accusations? Julia asked. Documented accusations. Accusations of witchcraft. He let the thunderbolt pierce through, then continued. History tells us that Duccio was accused of witchcraft, a serious medieval crime. But history does not reveal who accused him and how he escaped serious punishment or cruel death at the hands of the papal inquisitors. Escape how? Julia pursued. A bargain was struck, a deal was made, and a fee was paid. Something saved Duccio, and that something then allowed him to resume his life and his work, eventually producing Siena masterpieces like the Maesta. Is there any proof of Giotto's involvement in the affair? No, but I had a revelation. Not the spiritual or supernatural kind, but the academic kind. I had a revelation in Giotto's Padua chapel when I compared his frescoed wall betrayal scene to Duccio's wooden altarpiece rendering of the same biblical event. Wade paused and looked straight into Julia's eyes. I think Duccio was betrayed by Giotto. I think Taviana wanted to expose this, while opposing forces want the information suppressed. Julia stared at Wade in stunned silence. He continued. Giotto and Duccio were rivals, just like the powerful independent city-states of their birth, Florence and Siena. Wade brought his hand to his chin, then concluded. We need to find Giotto's final resting place, and I think I know where it is. Chapter 37. Holding the lantern, Wade spun around the center of the circular chamber to better examine his surroundings. His actions cast eerie shadows on the walls of the dig site, shadows that disappeared on 3 occasions. Julia noticed the same evaporating wall shadows and concluded, as did Wade, that there were 3 openings in the circular wall. Where did each lead to? Julia wondered. Wade used the compass function on his mobile device to determine which opening would most likely lead to his desired destination, underneath the bell tower. He explained his plan to Julia. She was skeptical. You actually think Giotto lies under his tower, even though there are no records suggesting this? They've never found his remains anywhere else, Wade surmised. Let's see where this opening leads. He moved in the direction his compass suggested. Julia quickly grabbed a nearby conventional high-powered flashlight, tested the strength of the beam, and then followed Wade, staying close behind. The normal-size entrance suddenly became a low-ceiling passageway with an uneven floor of randomly positioned stones. Their bent bodies advanced slowly forward. Julia's hunched walking position forced her to keep her head down, thereby relying totally on Wade's judgment regarding what lay ahead. The passageway eventually morphed into a low tunnel, forcing Wade to stop and reevaluate his decision to boldly advance to wherever the passageway might lead them. We can't keep advancing without getting down on our knees, Wade announced. Maybe we should turn back, David. Not yet. Let me go on alone for a few yards. The light from my lantern seems to disperse up ahead. Julia Cartier was not comfortable in tight spaces, small rooms, constricted areas, closed or boxed in. She did not consider herself clinically claustrophobic, but her anxiety in confined locations was nevertheless real. Overcoming this fear had, so far, been a lifelong battle for her. Wade remained confident and figured by dead reckoning that his progress would lead to something. Julia crouched down in a semi-sitting position, alleviating the strain on her back. Wade advanced on all fours, and soon, Julia heard a slight echo in his shout to her, announcing that he had discovered a subchamber. Despite her uneasiness, Julia was not turning back, determined to forge ahead. Curious, she endeavored to join Wade, hoping to maneuver the low passageway without scraping her bare knees on the abrasive rocks. Her smaller and shorter frame allowed her to walk with her body in a squatting posture, duck style. The bent forward motion she employed was successful, leading her into the new enclave where Wade awaited with helping hands. Both of their portable lamps emitted enough artificial light to expose a gloomy 20 by 30 yard rectangular room at least 2 yards high, resembling a small grotto chapel. The chamber was not large, but Julia appreciated the newfound breathing space. Although the professional dig team were surely aware of this place, the room was empty of any archaeological equipment. Cold stone, its only inhabitant. This was not an active dig site. The air was cool and humid. This space was not climate controlled. The crowded oratory contained 5 dusty above-ground freestanding tomb structures, with the largest at the further end, resembling a high altar. Julia again inspected each tomb on all sides, hoping to find identifiable writings, but found none. She moved close to Wade. "Why haven't these tombs been opened by the archaeologists?" "They can't," he responded, reminding Julia that the strict rules governing this excavation precluded any disturbing of tombs and burials. "Then how can we, or anyone, identify where Giotto rests?" Wade half listened to Julia's last statement. He was inspecting the largest sarcophagus. He held his lantern with his left hand while his right meticulously caressed the smooth stone facade with his fingers, searching for some kind of irregularity or indentation. The front and right side offered no such anomaly, but his fingers revealed something odd in the upper left-hand corner of the back side, just inches below the rock-solid covering. "Julia, come, I think I've got something here." She joined him and added her light beam in the direction of his fingers, still lingering near the source of a slight depression in the stone siding. Wade spit twice in his hand and returned it to the same area of the tomb and began using the moisture to clean a circular indentation. He repeated the cleaning process twice more, each time wiping the grime from his fingers and hand on his jeans. This continuing cleaning process began revealing a golden tint to what was otherwise surrounding stone. "Is that painted stone?" asked Julia. "No, it feels like metal." "Yeah, it's definitely metal of some kind, but it's not smooth. It feels like a relief engraving." Wade approached his eyes for close examination, concluding that the metal found within the circular cavity was definitely a golden engraved image. What really astonished him, however, was the image looking back at him. "Julia, give me the medallion." Chapter 38. Julia had temporarily forgotten about the medallion she still carried in her jacket pocket. When Wade asked for it, she felt a chill, unsure she still had the artifact. She quickly recovered when her fingers located and handed him the precious object. He removed it from its container, looked closely at its image, then proceeded to position it directly in front of the tomb's exposed round indentation. He gently pushed the medallion and rotated it against the metal inner image. Metal against metal. his fingers suddenly felt the identical twin, opposite, mirror images lock into place, allowing him to turn the medallion clockwise, causing the circular metal object inside to do the same. This rotating movement suddenly created a dull metallic sound, accompanied by the slight loosening of the tomb's top section. Julia could not believe what she was witnessing. She stood up, examined the tomb's cover, and hazarded it could easily be opened by two adults. "Are we allowed to open it?" Julia asked. "Are you kidding me? Given our situation, I think the Holy Church will forgive us, my dear. Of course we can open it." They each placed their lamps on the two nearest tombs, allowing them to use both their hands and full strength to slide the massive stone cover from its formerly locked position. The task was much easier than they expected. Once the now movable top was displaced enough to examine the tomb's interior, they retrieved their light sources and put them to work inside the vault. Wade gazed into the structure's inner sanctum and was immediately startled by three things. Firstly, the inside of the large tomb was very clean, with no scattered bones, debris, or dust to be found. Secondly, he noticed the only small loose object in the tomb appeared to be a scroll of some kind. And finally, leaning against the inner front wall were a stack of several flat wooden objects, resembling panels. Chapter 39. The interior of Giotto's tomb made for a splendid repository. Wade leaned inside and gently moved the wooden objects to view the colorful images imprinted upon each of them. He had no doubt. Duccio's missing panels had been found. "This is unbelievable," marveled Julia. "Truly incredible. Are they all there and in good shape?" "Yes, I think so," said Wade, still flabbergasted by the discovery. He prepared to reach deep inside the tomb to retrieve the scroll laying on the bottom. "Hold my legs, Julia." With her help, the retrieval was successful. He removed a sturdy ribbon encircling the scroll, gently unrolling the vellum parchment. Julia helped him hold the corners, thereby facilitating his examination of the document. The delicate single page was about 20 inches wide and 30 inches long, with handwritten text in a language similar to the one used on Giotto's tower plaque, the campanile text. Julia tried deciphering a few phrases, but frustratingly failed, as she had before. Wade liberated one hand from the parchment, substituting his lantern. He used his free hand to take several photos of the text with the intention of sending them to Andalusia for prompt analysis. "Julia, we need to get out of here and go back to the exhibition area so I can get a signal to send these photos for translation." "Won't we set off security alarms if we go back?" "I hope so. It's time to alert the authorities and let the world know what we've found." "But what about the panels?" "Don't worry, they're not going anywhere." Wade gently inserted the scroll in his back pocket, grabbed his lantern, and crawled out of the room with Julia close behind. The return journey seemed familiar, helping to accelerate their pace. Within minutes, they found themselves back in the dig zone and ready to ascend the 4 steps into the corridor towards the chained-off entrance they had traversed only a short while ago. "Now, follow me and get ready to trigger whatever security system they have in here. It might be loud, so beware." Julia nodded her approval and followed Wade, expecting the worst. They advanced as discussed, and reached the entrance point seemingly without causing any change to the darkness and silence of the crypt. Wade stopped before crossing the threshold of the forbidden corridor, preferring to remain off-limits to appraise the situation. He removed the protective chain, placed it on the floor, then checked his mobile device and noticed the return of a signal. He dispatched the photos to Andalusia and was pleased with the sent confirmation. "Now what?" Julia said softly. We have no choice but to re-enter the crypt and set off the alarms. I'm sure the scanners will capture our movements once we cross this line." Wade had not completely finished pronouncing his last word when suddenly the lights turned on. The crypt resurrected, fully lit, in the same manner as it was earlier in the day when tourists roamed the area. Julia was startled. Wade's body jolted back an inch. They were silent and did not move, still holding their lamps. The quietness was ominous, until weakly pierced by distant voices, which appeared to be conversing in Italian. Wade heard the voices first, then Julia did too. As the conversation drew nearer and got louder, Wade peeked from the corner of the entranceway to see who was approaching. Two men came into focus. Two men he had seen many times over the past few days. Two men who had not been helpful. Two men who tried to kill them. Their two sedan pursuers. Chapter 40. The presence of their pursuers stunned Wade. He turned to Julia and mimed soft walking movements while pointing down the corridor. She understood his meaning and proceeded to follow him back through the hallway, down the 4 steps and into the dig area. "It's the sedan guys," he whispered. "Let's hide apart," pointing at the 2 largest tombs at opposite ends of the chamber. Julia crouched down, and Wade kneeled behind the stone vaults, shielded, waiting in dead silence. They were no longer in total darkness. The site's dim illumination had returned along with the reactivation of the crypt's general lighting system. Seconds passed like minutes. They heard the faint echo of steps coming from the far end of the corridor. Julia guessed the men were tipped off by the metal chain and placard resting on the floor at the hallway's entrance. The footsteps got a bit louder as the men approached the dig area, then stopped for what seemed like an excruciatingly long time. Wade could now hear them exhaling. Julia stilled, stopped breathing, felt their proximity. Her heart pounded so hard she could almost hear it. The intruders did not speak, but their shadows betrayed their stealth communication gestures. When first seeing them in the crypt area, Wade noticed that they carried handguns. He assumed the weapons were now pointing towards their general area, ready to be discharged upon encounter. The footsteps resumed forward motion, abandoning the smooth, hard rock floor of the corridor for the uneven, coarse stones of the 4 steps. Wade tensed up, his body instinctively entering survival mode with all senses on full alert. His mouth went cotton dry. Julia shook with fright. She heard and felt a presence to her right slowly shifting around the protective tomb that was her safeguard. Without computing the consequences of her actions, she swung the heavy metal flashlight she still held in her right hand around the side of the tomb, a few inches from the ground. Her improvised weapon struck flesh and bone around the ankle area, causing its victim to stumble forward and scream in pain. He went down hard. Surprised by the sudden sharp noise and disturbance, Wade stood upright and faced the second pursuer, the capped man, across from his protective stone barrier. Julia's actions had not only temporarily disabled her pursuer, but distracted his partner, allowing Wade to swing his sturdy lantern towards the head of his confused stalker. The violent strike caused the man to discharge his weapon. Wade abandoned the protection of his tomb and sprung towards Julia's fallen pursuer. Wade lifted his right foot and forcefully struck the man on his elevated forehead, causing the back of his skull to hit the stony ground without mercy. Taking advantage of the severe head wounds inflicted on both of their pursuers, Wade grabbed Julia's upper arm and led her up the 4 steps into the corridor. They emerged into the crypt and ran towards the public entrance area. As they approached the exit, they encountered a mob of onrushing men and women brandishing weapons. They stopped and waited for the group to move closer to them, noticing that they were all wearing dark, close-fitting windbreaker jackets. The official-looking coats had 3 letters emblazoned on their upper left front, with larger ones on the back. Wade looked at Julia as they were surrounded by the contingent, wondering if they had been saved or captured by GDF, the Guardia di Finanza. Chapter 41. Surrounded by the GDF, Wade and Julia were quickly approached by one of the female agents, asking them to divulge the whereabouts of their 2 pursuers. Wade told the agent about the dig zone, specifying that the men in question had head wounds but were armed. The agent turned and rushed towards the described location, a dozen other agents in tow. Of the remaining officers, a man wearing a lighter-colored jacket, the only agent not carrying a weapon, made himself known to Wade and Julia by advancing directly towards them with an air of authority. "My name is Agent Orsini, and I am in charge of this unit. Are you all right, Mr. Wade? Miss Cartier?" They both nodded, waiting to hear more, still wondering if he and his brigade were friend or foe. Orsini continued, "We were made aware by a credible outside confidential source of your situation." Realizing the man in charge was talking about Sasha, Wade sighed with relief, pleased that Denary's security expert continued to be very effective. Orsini directed instructions to one of his men, then turned back to Wade and Julia. "Although we were not aware of your exact location in Florence, we identified the men seeking you and secretly followed them here." "Who are they?" asked Julia, finally feeling comfortable and safe in the presence of Agent Orsini and the men and women of his unit. Before Orsini could respond, he heard confirmation on the remote speaker microphone attached to his upper left side jacket pocket that 2 wounded men at the dig site had been disarmed and apprehended. Wade looked at Julia, relieved. Orsini acknowledged the incoming information, then directed one of his agents to call in a multiple occupancy ambulance. "Who are they?" Julia asked again. "These 2 men are officers from our agency. Officers gone rogue." Orsini's announcement was met by 2 perplexed looks, staring right back at him. He continued to explain. "These men are part of our agency's National Cultural Treasures Division, overseeing cases of art theft, counterfeiting, and smuggling. They were recently approached by a friend of yours, I believe." He glanced down at his small open notepad. "Ms. Taviana Buonosegna." "Yes, she was my best friend. Did they kill her?" "They are the prime suspects." "But why?" "According to our internal records, Ms. Buonosegna contacted our agency for help and met with both officers, relating her ongoing search for some lost paintings by one of her ancestors. She also told them that she was in possession of an heirloom of some kind that perhaps could help with the search, but she did not show them the artifact. This is what we know for sure. The rest of what I am about to tell you is speculation." Julia sat down on a nearby stone bench provided for the comfort of tourists. She finally understood why Taviana insisted on not involving the police. "We believe the 2 men concocted a plan to use your friend's information and heirloom to find the missing artwork themselves and sell the paintings on the black market. A market they knew very well." "You mean this was all about money?" Julia exclaimed with a tinge of sadness and regret in her voice. "Yes, this is what we think. The men broke into your friend's home to steal the artifact. They probably killed her when she unexpectedly returned to her apartment and was unwilling to divulge the location of her family heirloom." Wade, still standing, placed his hand on Julia's shoulder as she sank lower in the bench, dejected. She looked at him and tried to smile, but it just wasn't happening. Wade finally spoke, with anger in his voice. "Did they kill Father Umberto Ombri?" Orsini tilted his head to one side, nodding that he thought so. The Florence Ambulanza medical unit arrived with great commotion and rushed towards the wounded men. Wade felt his mobile device vibrate, having turned the alert sounds off hours ago. He had, by now, forgotten about the scroll document in his back pocket and photos sent to Andalusia. His curiosity was reignited. He gave Orsini the scroll, then joined a tired and disheveled Julia on the stone bench, intent on reading what Denary's translator had discovered. Chapter 42. Still shocked by what she had just been told about Taviana, Julia drank from a bottle of water handed to her by one of the GDF agents. She was emotionally exhausted, lost in her thoughts. She watched in silence and without emotion while the Ambulanza emergency medical team passed by with the two injured men wrapped securely on gurneys, wheeled towards the outside exit and an awaiting medical vehicle. Wade did not even lift his head as the captured pursuers, flanked by multiple GDF agents, paraded through. He was deep inside the translated electronic version of the ancient document now in the hands of the GDF. "David, the document you sent is very long, detailed, and technical. I will gladly perform a precise word-for-word translation if you wish, but that will take time. Until then, here is a summary of its contents for your immediate use." Wade continued reading, astonished by the words he saw. Andalusia's summary translation described the details of an official court judgment by the Papal Inquisition in the year 1302. The case adjudicated upon involved accusations of witchcraft brought against Duccio di Buonosigna by court officials. The accusations were, however, dismissed by the court because of the favorable character testimony of a prominent and respected citizen, Giotto di Bondone. The accused man's freedom was secured by the payment of a fee by the forenamed citizen. The fee paid to the court was a gold medallion of great value, imprinted with the payer's family crest. Wade sat back and lifted his eyes to the ceiling. He felt a chill between his shoulder blades. How could he have been so wrong about Giotto? The great master from Padua was not Duccio's enemy, he was his friend and savior. Chapter 43. Julia and Wade were escorted from the cathedral complex by the GDF and driven to a nearby office building. They were brought to the 4th floor and placed in a plain, generic meeting room with austere furniture, a long table and several chairs. The room temperature was comfortable, but the atmosphere was cold, a sharp contrast to the warm beauty of Florence. They sat in silence, waiting. Wade sensed the persistent ringing in his ears was louder than usual, most likely the after effect of the gun blast in the dig area. Julia stared straight, hands folded on the table. The now familiar Agent Orsini suddenly entered the room accompanied by an older woman of ample proportions, carrying a tablet, sternly dressed, wearing a no-frills pantsuit, unstyled short cropped hair, androgynous glasses, and no makeup. "This is Agent Bardi. She has been on this case from the moment our two agents went rogue. She knows as much as I do, and perhaps more. She will be taking your statements." Agent Bardi shook their hands and sat down facing them. Orsini grabbed the chair to her right and removed his GDF cap, revealing hair thinning towards inevitable baldness. Bardi produced a small recording device and placed it between Julia and Wade, Together, they commenced telling the entire story of their adventure. When Wade mentioned the involvement of the Martini brothers, Orsini stopped the recorder. "Did you say the Martini brothers?" "Yes, I did," said Wade. Orsini looked at Bardi, then continued. "The Martini brothers are well known to us, and have been involved in helping our criminal arts division solve many cases. They use their family fortune to restore and retrieve art. In this particular case, they wanted to retrieve lost panels taken from a medieval altarpiece." Hearing this, Wade was relieved that his client was altruistic and one of the good guys. When Julia concluded her statement, she sat back and listened as Wade addressed the agents with a cascade of questions, hoping to get a waterfall of answers. The missing panels in the tomb. How? When? And why? "I think I can help you with that, Mr. Wade," said Bardi. "And by the way, I am utterly impressed with your deductions and instincts that led you to the missing treasures." Wade nodded with modest appreciation for the compliment. Bardi continued, delivering her words in a flat, monotone fashion. "As you know, the intact Maesta was dismantled in 1711, with the main body of the altarpiece remaining at the Siena Cathedral. Many of the upper and lower panels were sold, disseminated, or lost. We now think the lost panels were actually in the possession of Giotto's descendants, who were involved in 18th century excavations of their famous ancestors' Campanile bell tower. We believe they were the ones who placed the panels in the tomb for safekeeping during times of dangerous political upheavals raging on the Italian peninsula. But, as generations go by, undocumented acts such as these are often forgotten, waiting to be rediscovered sometime in the future." "That explains the who and the how, but tell us about the why," Wade insisted. "Family pride," Bardi answered. "Family pride. When the Giotto family came into possession of the Maesta panels, they felt obligated to protect them during times of strife in order to honor the courageous and generous comportment of their famous ancestor towards his friend and contemporary artist, Duccio. Giotto had acted honorably, and this made them determined to act in the same manner." Satisfied, Wade sat back, lowered his tense shoulders, and let his head slowly drop forward. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, held it for a moment, then exhaled. Chapter 44. The early morning sun vanished behind dark rain clouds. The heavy raindrops began slowly hitting the well-manicured grounds of the Cimitero Monumentale di Milano, Milan's largest public cemetery. Julia stood alone with Wade, minutes after a small memorial service was held at Taviana Buonosigna's open gravesite. The few other mourners, mostly the deceased's academic co-workers, had departed just in time to avoid the incoming barrage of droplets accompanied by disparate lightning and thunder. "Thanks for staying the extra days, David." She smiled at him, but her heart was not in it. "Are you going directly back home, or do you have business elsewhere?" "No, I'm heading back home to New York this afternoon," Wade responded sympathetically. He opened a large black umbrella, covering Julia and part of himself. Their eyes returned to the silver casket in front of them, as they, and Taviana's coffin, got drenched by the uncontrollable downpour. "I'm going to miss her, David. I'm going to miss her a lot. She was..." Julia fought back tears. "She was wonderful," struggling to fully pronounce the word wonderful. Wade reached for her hand unsuccessfully as she moved forward to place one single yellow rose on top of the casket. He followed her movement in order to continue to protect her from the rain. Her eyes met his appreciatively. Then she turned to walk away towards her car. As they strolled past wet gravestones and faded markers, she noticed his rental parked nearby. Arriving at her sports vehicle, still unrepaired, brandishing the scars of their traumatic highway collision, she looked at him in the eyes and said, "Keep in touch?" "You bet." David Wade kissed Julia Cartier on the lips, smiled, and gallantly helped his new friend glide into her wounded chariot. He stepped back, hardly noticing the sound made by the engine's ignition, juxtaposed against the penetrating noise of the heavy downpour. Lightning flashed, then thunder shook the air. Unperturbed, he watched her drive away. Epilogue. 3 months after their northern Italian adventure, Julia Cartier and David Wade met in Siena for a red carpet premiere exhibition event for the unveiling of the newly restored and reunified Maesta Lost Panels at the Museo dell'Opera Metropolitana del Duomo. It was a 5-star black tie event attended by high government officials, art community elites, celebrities, and of course, the paparazzi. Wade arrived in Siena only hours before the event. He rushed, knowing Julia was attending. He navigated the heavy security detail and walked the red carpet, stopping to chat and pose for pictures with various dignitaries who were now well aware of who he was and appreciative of his tremendous contribution to the evening's purpose. Agents Orsini and Bardi from the GDF were present and dressed in their finest. Seeing Wade enter the museum building, they approached him with wide smiles, offering friendly handshakes. They spoke a few moments, then Wade excused himself and searched for Julia. The Martini brothers approached Wade, shook his hand, and exchanged pleasantries. They thanked him again for his work and asked, in a discreet manner, if the bonus money, in addition to the agreed-upon full payment for his work, was satisfactory. He told the brothers that he had been very well compensated by them for his efforts, and thanked them for their generosity. "We never wanted possession of the panels, Mr. Wade. We simply hoped to locate them and help put the Maesta back together. And thanks to you, we have succeeded." Wade acknowledged their statement with gratitude. He was about to excuse himself when he felt a gentle tap on his shoulder. He turned to face an exquisitely dressed young woman with beautiful coiffed hair and elegant accessories to match. "Good evening, Julia." "Hello, David." "Nice to see you again." "Likewise." "You look stunning." "So do you." They stopped for a moment, looked down and up at each other, then laughed at the formal tone of their greeting exchange. They hugged, then laughed again, and each grabbed a flute of champagne and toasted the occasion like long-lost friends. They stood together throughout the short, well-staged unveiling ceremony and pleasantly acknowledged the crowd's applause when signaled out for their heroic deeds. Julia took Wade's hand and led him to view the once-lost Maesta panels. The paintings now hung in their proper place above and below the main body of the altarpiece. The historic reunification and beauty of this artistic treasure was overwhelming for both of them. Wade thought of Denary, knowing that his team would never fully appreciate the extent of their individual contributions to this marvelous happening. And that is how it should be. He let go of Julia's hand and wrapped his arm around her waist. She put her hand on top of his as they moved towards a bronze commemorative plaque hanging next to the Maesta. Julia translated the Italian words aloud for Wade to hear. "In honor and memory of Taviana Buonosigna and Father Umberto Omri, who both lost their lives so that the world can forever appreciate and enjoy the radiant beauty of Duccio's Maesta. Wade slowly lowered his eyes as Julia gently caressed his hand and solemnly placed her head on his shoulder. The end. I'm Mark Vinet, and I hope you enjoyed the listen.